This August 27th regular meeting of the Fairfield Board of Education is called to order. Present we have Ms. Pitko, Ms. Leeper, Mr. Dwyer, Mrs. Gerber, myself, Mrs. Vitale, our new superintendent, Mr. Cummings, Mr. Asa, Ms. Jacobson, Mrs. Maxcanelli, and Mr. Peterson. Can I ask you all please to rise for the pledge? Mr. Cummings, will you lead us in the pledge?
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Everybody ready? Welcome back. I hope everyone had a nice summer. We have a full agenda, so we're going to get right to work. We'll start with public comment. If any members of the public would like to give public comment, I invite you to come forward and please give your name and address for the record. Okay. Seeing none, we will go right on to new business, environmental testing and school field sites. Mr. Cummings, first of all, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We are very excited to have you here. And even though that you just started 2 weeks ago, it seems like you have been our superintendent for a very long time.
Feels that way too.
Enough of the welcomes. Get
Right to it.
right to it.
Okay. Well, thank you and good evening, everyone. I'm going to give a brief update on the status of the fields around the schools, and I'm going to start by making a couple distinctions that I think are important and might be getting lost in the process and a lot of the information that's coming back from both the town and the schools. So first of all, the first distinction I want to make is that the town began this process by testing fields at the school sites, but also fields at other locations in town. They weren't all school sites. And that process has begun, the testing has begun, the town has begun to receive results on those tests. And as you know, over the weekend, we got the tests back on the first 8 school sites. Those tests essentially cleared five of our their fields, excuse me. But there were concerns raised about 3 sites, one at Mill Hill, one at Riverfield, and one at Jennings. So that's one distinction, because at the same as they've working through that process, the Board of Education, the Fairfield Public Schools, opened a second process, and that was testing the additional fields at each of the school sites. And that process of testing has only just begun. It began yesterday, starting with our high schools and moving through our middle schools and elementaries. And so that's a parallel track to what the town is doing with a delay in terms of getting results. The town has started to get results. We're going to be waiting a week now or so to start getting our results. Same testing firm is being used by both the town and the schools to make sure that the results are similar to each other in terms of reporting out to the public. But that is 2 distinct processes, united processes, I should say, but they are two parallel tracks. That's one distinction I want to make. The addendum to that, of course, is over the weekend, based on the results of the 3 test locations at, again, Riverfield, Mill Hill, and Jennings, I made the decision that we should also look at the playscapes. Now, this is the second distinction I made. So we've broadened our testing areas from both the playground grassy areas to now the playscapes. And that's the second distinction I want to make. When we refer to playscapes in reference to our school sites, what we're talking about there is those areas that are covered with mulch. They have playground equipment on them. And we deliberately chose that word because the word playground was becoming an all-inclusive word, and it was losing its distinction. That initially started out as simply referring to the grass areas. And as you know, we didn't really think our playscapes were of a concern or needed to be of a concern. But when I looked at those 3 test locations on Sunday morning, they raised just the concern for me, particularly, as I've said before, the one at Jennings and its proximity, its close proximity to the playscape at Jennings, one of the playscapes at Jennings, that we should just do our due diligence and make sure that those were clear too. So those are the 2 distinctions, the town track and the school track on the testing, as well as the idea of playgrounds and, in a much narrower sense, what the playscapes are. Now, having said that, we are in the process of testing our school fields and playscapes. The playscapes we're working on a additional purchase order requisition for that, so those have not yet begun, but we've begun the testing on our fields. As I said yesterday, they started working on the high schools. I know they're at middle schools and elementaries today. And we expect a similar expedited turnaround on results. So we're hoping 48 to 72 hours. We'll get the results, we'll analyze those results, and we're using the website we've created, which I believe most people have access to, but you can link to it right off our main page. And that will be continually updated with information both about the fields as well as any other questions people might have. So for example, we've had a question over the last day or two about the containers that were placed in front of the schools for security purposes last year and what those are filled with. The material used in those boxes is clean fill. It did not come from the town, but we're putting that answer out on the website as well. So I would encourage people that if you have questions that the school can answer that are related to school activities, to work that the schools have done, please use that form online, and we will get those answers out as quickly as possible. Questions about remediation plans, questions about the testing that the town has done, we are following the town's lead at this point. We're waiting for information. We understand that that's a process that they have to work through. Our school principals, our teaching staff are well aware of the concerns around the playscapes, the playgrounds, and are making adjustments school by school based on the facilities that they have open to them on what they're going to do when the students return on Thursday, how they're going to handle recess, what that's going to look like. So, you know, I've seen some excellent communication from our building principals around the modifications they're taking to make those adjustments. So we'll work through this. We're hopeful on a timeline. If concerns continue to be raised, if any of the testing sites show concerns that continue to be raised, then we're going to work with the town, we're going to work with the environmental consultant on remediation plans. As I've said multiple times, and I cannot say it enough and stress enough for you, this is a difficult process for everybody, but it's made relatively simple by the basic fact that student safety comes first. So that's the decision maker, and then you've got to work through it. Once you made the decision that student safety has to go first, then you have to make adjustments to plans and modifications along the way. And we'll continue to do that. So I don't know if there's any questions, or if myself, Mr. Papageorge, and I know we have Sans Cleary as well as First Selectman.
We do,
Mike
and I'm going to
Tetra.
invite our first selectman, Mike Tetro, and our director of the head of the health department, Fairfield, to come up and just introduce yourselves and be available for the board if you have any questions.
Bring Angela, so.
And Mr. Papageorge, our executive director of operations, why don't you come up as well? And I will bring it to the board if anybody has any questions just about next steps or any of the test results or any of the timeline of the town. Mrs. Gerber?
Well, one thing that I had mentioned to Mrs. Vitale and Mr. Cummings, and I don't know if you had a chance to talk to Mr. Cleary yet, but one thing I think that might be helpful from past experience with the Osborne Hill PCB situation back in 2012 is that I know that there were a couple of, like, an FAQ sheet and specific information about PCBs, because at the time that was the issue that was at hand. So perhaps if there are some one sheet information things that we could have, that we could provide on our website, on the town website, just so that, if people, because obviously everyone's Googling all of the names of these things, but it might be helpful to have, the EPA report or something like that, just something that's very easy and quick to understand, but will just provide information in one place for any of the possible concerns that we might have. So I'm just hoping, I know it wasn't a problem last time, so I'm sure it wouldn't be this time.
Yeah, so that fact sheet was actually developed by the Department of Public Health at our request. And so one of the things we're waiting to do is wait to get the rest of the sample results in and then have a sort of omnibus fact sheet about each of the exceedances, so to explain those things, those particular issues, and provide a little bit more information about those concerns, those constituents, and any risks related to them.
Thank you.
Ms. Jacobson?
And just to follow up to that question is when that is created, if possible, and I know we're not knowing what any remediation will look like at this point, but if you can include in the FAQs just information about the remediation or just what we may have available, like during the school day or at night, or just how that all works would be helpful, I feel like, for parents as well as they head to school.
Sure, we can do that.
Mr. Peterson?
I'll try to make this quick. I'm not even sure this raises the level of question. It may be for Mr. Cummings ultimately. In the research that I think all of us are doing, all of us are Googling, all of us are looking at test results. One of the things that I noticed about mulch, and we looked at that test boring site on Jennings is close to the mulch area. It appears that one of the concerns with mulch and arsenic is the use of wood that's improperly recycled. It's been sealed, it's been made into mulch. So in this process, it might be useful to examine what our source of mulch is. I have no idea whether it's it's the yard in the town or elsewhere, but just in terms of leaching out, I don't even know if that's a concern about arsenic contamination. But that would be a thing that I would be interested in seeing the custody chain of that material.
I believe Mr. Papa George can speak to that right now, because that concern has come up.
The mulch that we use is actually a certified playground fiber. It's delivered every year from a certified company. We actually I believe it's up on the website now, the certification that the company provided for us. They provide playground mulch to municipalities throughout the state and beyond.
That's very helpful.
Mr. Asa?
Just real quick, certified by the state?
It's certified by the company that actually produces it. So it's not a state certification. It's a certified that it's a clean fiber-ish mulch. It's actually not even like a tree mulch. It's an actual fiber mulch.
Okay. So we're getting the same material as many other surrounding towns?
Correct.
Okay.
In Connecticut and out.
Thank you. My question with regards to remediation to the first selectman and Sands Cleary, I know there's been a lot of communication to the town, to the boards, to everybody, so we appreciate that. Can you just touch on what the next steps are? I know that there was some communication about that there's going to be some meetings about the remediation and waiting for the results and whatnot. Could you just touch for the board and for the public quickly on what the next steps and who is going to be involved? So on school sites, will people from the Fairfield Public Schools be involved in those high-level meetings determining what's going to be done?
Do you want me to start? You pick up? Sure. Okay. Just let me answer that at the very basic level, and then Sands can chime in. Basically, from a standpoint of the remediation, we're following a very strict guideline that we're going to listen to what Ty and Bond has to say. If you're looking for somebody who's in control, our licensed environmental consultant is the person in control. They're going to do that in conjunction with DEEP, Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, as well as the Department of Health. We're in everything that we're sharing with the town, we're also sharing with those 8 representatives from those 2 departments to make sure everybody's on the same page. So we're going to follow the recommendations that come out of Ty and Bond, very simply.
Sure, and so in terms of what's going on now, so we're waiting for the remediation action plans from the consultant. We met with the contractor from Ty and Bond, and they are going out to these sites and doing some, like they did at Gould Manor Park, some additional testing to define the scope of what's needed to be done. And then they're drawing up those plans. Those plans will be reviewed by DEEP and Connecticut DPH. And once they are, it's not a true approval process because they don't have to be signed off on by them, but we want to ensure, we've asked our contractor to have something in writing back from both those agencies that they are in agreement with the direction that the remediation action plan is going to go, and then we'll begin the process of selecting, or we're in the process of selecting a remediation contractors. So Ty and Bond will oversee the work and a remediation contractor will come in.
And may I just ask a piggy?
Just to further answer that, obviously to some degree we're waiting for the test results to come back so we know what it is. As you saw from the first 3, there are different remediation plans for each school in a sense. The second thing I want to be clear on is we have been in contact and communication with Superintendent Cummings and Chairman Vitale over the weekend as these things kind of popped up. So I know at one of our calls, superintendent was driving in some bad cell areas if we're trying to talk on the phone to keep this up. So I just want you comfortable that we are doing this in close coordination with the school district to make sure that everybody's aware and everybody has input as we go through this.
Yeah, and I guess just to finalize that, I guess I should have phrased it more, Will. So at schools that we know that there will be some sort of remediation, which will come out soon as far as the plan, will building administrators be in those meetings when they come up with the plan? So for example, if they are remediating ground next to a playscape at a school, and the principal is the one ultimately running that building and going to have to make sure that kids are away from there and whatnot, I just want to make sure that they're involved in the process.
Yeah, when you talk about at those meetings, it really is Ty and Bond coming up with a plan. It's not something that we're sitting down developing or negotiating by any stretch. It's whatever Ty Bond comes back and says, this is what you do, that's what we're going to do. We'll certainly make whoever you would like informed about that, so they can, both be informed, ask any questions, and to the extent want to supplement that in any way, certainly.
I would then formally request that if at any school properties remediation is done, that the building administrators have a direct communication line with Ty and Bond and are part of that remediation process planning.
I think we can do that.
Ms. Pico, followed by Mr. Dwyer.
Mr. Asa actually started my question. You asked about the timeline. I think very specifically, parents at these schools really want to know how long. How long is it going to take until my site is remediated? And I know that you answered that the timeline is coming really from the consultant, but can you get, are we talking weeks, months?
Yes, so the sampling, the second round of sampling to define it should begin hopefully later this week, early next week, and that will guide it. They will, have a plan in place probably within a week, and then there's a process of making sure we have an abatement contractor, and that everything, all the communication, as has been suggested, is in place before we start anything. We are hoping within a few weeks to begin this, and these are very, very small projects, at least Jennings and Riverfield are very small projects that should only take, in some cases, a few hours of work, and so we're thinking those will move a lot quicker. Mill Hill is a little bit different of a project, and so we're waiting to see what the remediation action plan there will entail. But we were hoping to move, the directive that we've been working under is let's move as fast as we can, let's get it in place, let's use, state bidded contractors that are already available to us to move this along as fast as we can. So we have, in our meeting with the Ty and Bond, it was very clear, we told them, start now. If you have people in town now, go out today and start that sampling now. And he said that's what we'll try to do then. And so they're moving as fast as they can to do all this work for both our both sides here.
Okay.
Mr. Asa.
Just to follow up on that, when you said second round of testing, were you referring to those 3 sites that came back
Exactly.
with exceedance?
Yes.
Okay. So that's not talking about the other sites and everything second. That's just second round is purely those 3 sites.
The second round is to develop a profile around that so you know how much to remediate. You've got a spot where it's been identified. Now the question is, what's the profile around that? So that's what we're going to go back or that's what Ty and Bond is going back to do. So they have that, then they can put together a remediation plan. At each step of the way here, we've expedited the test results coming back. And we've basically made it very clear to Ty and Bond how important it is that we get these fields back in operation, back as safe as they can be as soon as possible.
Thank you for the clarification.
And thank you for expediting the testing on these fields. We appreciate you putting the schools first, and hopefully we'll get the rest of the results back by the end of the week. But Mr. Dwyer?
I was happy to hear that you and the superintendent are working closely together to resolve this. As I understood the superintendent's comment, while we took the lead on getting testing of additional sites, the town is taking the lead on the remediation project. And so my question is, do you need any decisions or assistance from the Board of Ed? Or as soon as you get the results, you'll just act on it as quickly as possible?
We're taking the lead on the 20 sites we identified and other sites that come up that we're still evaluating if the pile was used in any other places. So that's an ongoing operation. In terms of the school district, and the superintendent and I were talking about that, was that this morning or yesterday?
Yesterday morning.
Yesterday morning. We've been meeting a lot these days, sorry. And basically the plan, we'll come up with a tie and bond remediation plan, and let's say for School A. And then, as been requested, make sure it's shared with the school administration, superintendent, and make sure we're all in agreement on that moving forward. As soon as we get that agreement, we'll move forward on it. So we want to get these, cleaned up as soon as we can to make sure that the fields are safe. But that communication and that coordination, I think, is what we've been talking about in terms of, as much as there might be parallel tracks in some of this, that anything we're doing, obviously, especially on school property, that we're doing with your knowledge and approval of the timing and what we're taking, approach we're taking there. So,
That's correct.
Thank you.
Mrs. Maxinelli?
Okay, a few questions. First of all, just to clarify, because I've heard from a few people, can you explain how tie and bond was selected?
My understanding was they were on the state bid list of licensed environmental professionals. I believe the conservation director, interim public works director, with the purchasing director, just selected a contractor off that list, and so that's how tie and bond was selected, because they're on the state bid list and available to us.
And so, because something that we've heard from a few parents is that, oh, well, we want to continue with independent testing from that. So I don't know, are you getting those emails in terms of how do you respond to parents who ask for that?
As far as medical testing?
No.
Or testing of
Site.
other grounds and sites?
Yeah.
Very little we've reached out to the people that have emailed and answered them. We haven't had really any about expanding the site that I'm aware of.
Okay, then I might be conflating emails with social media, but just that query out there, so I was just wondering how that was being addressed. And Mr. Cummings, you, in your presentation, thank you, in going through very kind of quickly, two comments you said that I didn't catch. You referenced getting a purchase order. Could you explain what that was for
Well,
again?
we've been working, and the town has, so go back a second, we talked about, when we decided to initially expand our tests, we wanted to look at the fields that were not on the town's list, right?
Right.
We identified those fields, and and the town then took that on as part of their payment. They were gonna start to pay those. So that was the initial first purchase order, as it were. When we expanded the scope further this weekend and started to talk about the playscapes, we have to now get a bid from the contractor on that as well, because now that's additional work. So we're in the process of finalizing that.
So what aspect of any of that will be coming out of our budget?
I believe right now, none of that,
That's
based on what I heard last evening, yes. Thank you to the town.
Okay. Another phrase you used, Mr. Cummings, I just want to clarify in case anybody else heard it, is that you said as all these results come in, we will analyze the results.
Yeah,
And I was hoping you could clarify we.
Yeah, I'm not putting on a white suit. We will analyze what was given back to us to make determination, and really essentially following exactly the process that the town is doing, taking the results and listening to the experts around this, making decisions about, do we have clean fields? Are we able to reopen those fields? Do they meet the criteria that the state has established, and can we bring the spaces back online? Or are we going to have similar conversations that the town is having with tie and bond around remediation plans? That's the unknown at this point.
And on that whole idea, to Mr. Cleary, you had on the website, I think to me it was a little bit unclear, because on that chart of the school sites where it said remediation required, but if you read the text that went with it, there was an indication that remediation was not required, but in an abundance of caution, these three sites were they had exceeded certain levels.
Okay.
Again, different for the different sites. I didn't say exceedance.
I had exceeded for different contaminants at the 3 sites, but that based on grass cover or whatever else, and where it was used, it was not required. But again, in an abundance of caution, we were doing it anyway, and I was hoping you could clarify that.
So I think what that is alluding to is interim controls. So for example, when the results came back, we at Gould Manor, and similar with the 3 schools, we asked our consultant, we asked DPH, and we asked DEP, is there any other interim controls, things we do between now we know we have some degree of exceedance above a standard. Is there anything we need to do between now and when those materials are remediated to further protect children and people that may be on the fields? The guidance we were given from our remediation contractor, from the Department of Public Health, who's really the lead agency on risk, said, you know, the things that we put in place in terms of, for example, Gould Manor, removing any visible pieces of shingles that contained asbestos, that was sufficient. The town then said, we want to go a little further, and we fenced off those areas that were tested and came back high. So the areas where there were exceedances now at Gould Manor Park are fenced off. In the same way, we've gone out and covered the areas where the exceedances were at the schools with fabric, and the schools has gone a step further even to say, we're just not going to use the fields at all until we get the definitive word that, you know, that the school is cleared on all aspects. And so that's the going beyond what the state recommended.
Right, so, and I did find the sentence. It said that the Connecticut Department of Public Health was consulted regarding these results and advised that given the levels found and the typical use of these areas, such use would not cause any health effects. And I was wondering if you could explain that. And I'm not saying that obviously we're not satisfied with that,
Sure.
but if you could explain exactly what they mean.
Yeah, so, and again, there's we took from the public forum that was held last Wednesday at Fairfield Ludlow High School, we took Meg Harvey, who made those comments, excerpts from that video and combined them all, her comments initially and then her responses to the question. So that's the best resource I can direct people to get the full explanation of what she means by that, because she does, in my opinion, a brilliant job of explaining, and I will butcher it now in my best to try and explain it, but the levels at which you would cause health effects for these parameters all contain a very significant safety factor. If you remember from Osborne Hill, the level for airborne PCBs has a 300, there's a safety factor of 300, so that, and that's a safety factor of, those levels would have to be, 300 times higher until they caused health effects. And in the same way, lead, that number 400 parts per million in soil does not bump up right against where health effects would happen. It's far significant. And she mentions 10,000 parts per million, 20, 30, 50,000 parts per million is where she starts to get some concern. So 400, 500, 410, whatever it may be, around that area, while it is an exceedance and it will be addressed through a remediation plan, it's not a cause for alarm in terms of nothing happens between 399 and 401. It's the same, it's just a slight change in risk. It's kind of like, and I always use this example of, your risk changes every day through the different activities you ever do every day. Whether when you step out of your house and you get into your car, your risk just changed. When you step into the shower to take a shower, your risk just changed for different activities. When you step onto a soccer field to play soccer, your risk changed for physical injuries just by stepping onto that field. So your risk is always fluctuating a little bit. And in some ways, or if you eat a lot of tuna, your risk for PCBs in your body goes up. So it's these subtle fluctuations that are going on, and potentially in some theoretical world, you could calculate the change in risk, but effectively what Meg Harvey was saying is that the standards by which the residential remediation standard, that 400 parts per million is based upon, it takes into account a child living in, that substance being in the child's primary living space, in their yard, and then being exposed to it 7 days a week, 365 days a year for 30 years. And that's the standard they say, that they start getting concerned about. What Meg Harvey is saying is that the level of exposure that we would expect to see, given those types of scenarios, where the levels that we're seeing and where they are, given that there's a good healthy grass cover in most cases in these areas, with the exception of the Riverfield one, which is far off to the side. It's kind of like a dirt road. So given that the kids would not spend a significant amount of time in those particular areas, there's no sign that they're digging or playing in the soils in those areas, and they're only exposed, for a recess period for a short period of time, 20 to 30 minutes per day, and that time is not typically spent in that one singular area where we're seeing these exceedances. So I think that's what she's getting at, but watch the video. I'm a very bad preview.
Okay, and then finally, and I was there, so I did hear her say that, but that had been prior to these results coming back. So that's what I was seeking to clarify.
Sure.
And just one final point as I put this out to Mr. Cummings and whichever staff members, and to Mr. Tetra and Mr. Cleary, is that my hope would be maybe is that once this remediation plan, once this takes shape, if you could please be available to the PTAs, if those PTAs host a meeting for their parents of their community, because obviously not each of these PTAs have identical concerns with each other, and I know that when Osborne Hill had its PCB issue, that it was very helpful to that community to have Dr. Title there, Mr. Cullen there, and just whomever can speak knowledgeably to what's happening, how quickly, and timeline and everything, not just relying on email postings or whichever else. I would just hope that Mr. Cummings, if you coordinate that with the PTAs, I think it would be very helpful for parents.
And if I could just respond to the what you alluded to, and I did ask Meg Harvey after these results came in, has your opinion that you expressed in the video, do I need to pull the video down? Has it changed at all? And she said, not one bit. That you can leave that up there. I've looked at these results. I feel comfortable having that same statement out there.
Thank you.
Ms. Jacobson.
Just two quick follow-ups. So as our year commences and Parks and Rec eventually, hopefully, and school sports get back going, how are we going to change our process, or what is the plan for this year when those areas get thinned out? This is how, sometimes fill is used by the goalie posts and on our fields. What is going to be different this year in terms of where or how we go about that process this year than we had in the past?
We'll certainly confirm this, but it's my understanding since about 2015 that private contractors have done the dressing in the fields and done a lot of, and they have used their own sources of topsoil for what that is. So we'll certainly make sure that continues, and we can follow up with Superintendent Cummings to make sure that's the case, to confirm everything on that. But it's my understanding that most of our field operations have been turned over to private contractors, so it's not going through and coming anywhere close to fill that might come from this. And second, just to be clear, there's been no material moved off the pile in the Public Works yard since December 13th, 2016.
Okay, thank.
What went to Pennsylvania?
Oh, the contaminated material, correct. But that was done under a very strict plan from our LEP at the time, who was not time bond, just for the record, and under the guidance from the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Because of the nature of that contaminant, it was brought on site by Julian on November 29th. That's the type of thing that you have to remediate right away, and we went full speed on that also.
Mr. Asa?
One final follow-up on your question, because that was a good one. But I'm sure this is going to raise another question from your answer, being that private contractors will use their own soil, their own source. Are there any state guidelines or anything that they're supposed to be abiding, these private contractors, to, that they would have actually a paper trail, so that when we hire these people, they can show us on paper that this soil that they're bringing to us is certified and tested and clear?
simplest, I think, that we'll have to check with Brian Carey, our interim superintendent of public works, and also our conservation director on that. I'm just not clear on that at the moment, so I don't want to mislead you with an answer.
Okay, that's just something that I think we
Very,
would
very
be,
reasonable question,
Yeah.
and
if you could get back to us,
to
that
some
would be
degree,
great.
when we asked about the contractors, and one in particular who won the bid to do a lot of that, we were told he bought his topsoil from another source. So we know, I'm going to suggest we know that's the case. Whether there's a complete paper trail for that or not, I'm just not clear on that, so I don't want to answer. I don't want to mislead you with an answer on that.
Okay, I'll look forward to a response.
Okay.
Mrs. Gerber?
Well, just to follow up on that, because that actually came up at Parks and Rec, and that was something that Anthony Calabrese had mentioned, that I know it used to be Tarantino, and now they've changed names, and I can't remember the name of the new company. Diamond. Yeah, that they apparently get all of their dirt, everything from somewhere upstate Connecticut, and Anthony seemed to know where it came from, so I'm assuming that there may very well be an easy way to check that, but that topic came up at our meeting last week, and so that was his answer.
Anybody else? Do you have a date for your next public forum that you may want to share, just being some parents may be watching our meetings and not watching
Oh,
some
thank
of
you.
the other ones?
Not at this point. I talked about doing two this week. That was before I realized there was a Board of Finance and Board of Education meeting this week that we'd also be at, and that chews up available evenings rather quickly. We expect to have the results back sometime this week, and also incorporating, I think, a very good suggestion, and I'd love to be able to coordinate with somebody here about getting out to the PTAs in the impacted schools, so that we can kind of take our road show to them and do that. I think that is something I'd be very interested in doing, and if there's any guidance as to who to coordinate that with.
We should coordinate through my office, absolutely.
Okay. We'll certainly do that and start with that one, and so we can keep the flow of public information going.
There is that kickoff PTAC leadership meeting, and I forget the date of it, but it's coming up fairly quickly. 13th. So that might be
We have to
something
look
to
at that.
coordinate with.
I've seen their agenda, it's pretty full. We may have to.
Yeah, I think
But
it's a
this is
different
an
kinda-
important topic.
Yep. Well, I'm wondering too, if there's something we could do with, and we'd have to obviously reach out to the schools, but if we could back up with open houses, which are already on the calendar. So we have to look at that.
Thank you, gentlemen, for coming tonight and answering our questions. Appreciate the flow of communication over the weekend, and you're keeping us in the loop. And if there's anything that you need from us, please just let us know. I appreciate you taking the time tonight. I know it's been busy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Update and approval of plans for Sherman project. Mr. Papa George,
Come on back.
come on back. We also have.
I was just to say, we're going to bring up Sal and his team.
We the board needs to approve plans of the Sherman project, so I'm going to get the motion on the table, and then we'll let these gentlemen give us an update on the project and tell us what we need to do. Recommended motion that the Board of Education approve the Sherman project plans as enclosed. Can I have a motion? Mrs. Gerber, seconded by Mr. Asa. Mr. Papa George, Mr. Morbido, who would like to give the intro?
Actually, I would turn it over to the chairman of the building committee.
Mr. Lang, welcome. Just please state your name for the record.
Hi, Eric Lang, Chair of the Roger Sherman Building Committee. Last time I was before all of you was, I think, in March or April of this year. At that time, we had requested approval for a change in scope, namely removal of the addition to the gymnasium for the stage, which was putting the project over budget. At that time also, we were under the impression, after initial meetings with the state, that pursuit of state reimbursement through the OSCG&R process would not be possible. Since that time, the state has reversed their position, and and they have opened up the majority of the project to reimbursement. So we are, and that's ultimately what brings us before you tonight. As far as an update for the project, we pushed certain elements. We kind of fast-tracked them to get some work done this summer, namely modifications to the bus loop and additional parking in the front of the building. The start of the electrical upgrade to support the new air conditioning system that will be going in next summer, and the replacement of all the lockers in the school. The lockers were delivered today and are, as I'm hearing, all in place with some final trim work and fastening to be done tomorrow, just in the nick of time. And there will be some additional trim, namely the sloped top, that will be done at a later time outside of school hours. Where a couple pieces didn't make it on the truck. So, but the lockers will be functional for the first day of school, and it's one little piece of good news for this summer. As far as the budget goes, I provided a updated budget to Ms. Vitale late this afternoon. I don't know if you've all
I have
seen
given
it.
it to everybody. I gave it to the board earlier.
But we are still trending on budget. The budget that I'm mainly referring to is the FEMA budget, because that is the be-all and end-all. This is based on some revisions to this from what you have seen the last time I was here, was the contracts that we bought out this summer for the electrical upgrade, the lockers, the site work, as well as revised estimates from Silver Petroselli, the architect on the job, for the work that will be executed next summer. As far as schedule goes, I think I'll probably hand it over to Charles Warrington with Colliers, who's the owner's rep on the job, who can kind of provide some more detail on that.
Sure. Good evening. Chuck Warrington, Director of Project Management with Colliers Project Leaders, formerly Colliers International. So yeah, so over the summer, we've been doing the enabling work. The lockers are being installed, finished up towards the end of this month. Really, it comes down to the next steps. About a month ago, we went up to the state to revisit the potential for reimbursement. I know we went back up there in January, and the initial reaction was that they didn't want to reimburse due to their policies. For some reason, they did make a change, and we went up and talked to them about what the scope of the work was. Primarily, there's the new air conditioning system, fire protection systems, which, improves life safety for the school. Also, indoor air quality is one thing we're stressing with these new air conditioning systems. And I think getting more into the details of what the scope entailed with the state. I think they had a clear picture of exactly what it is that you're trying to achieve with the project, and they're finding ways to help us with the project and to help us reimbursement. The lockers are still going to be ineligible. I believe they're always ineligible for replacement, and in some of the abatement associated with it. But with the mechanicals, the major portion that we're going to be seeking approval on for that, they're going to be helping us with. We still have to discuss some of the details. There are still select elements in an alteration project that they may claim they're ineligible, but I think a majority of those will probably be eligible. So during that meeting, they said to go ahead and get the grant application in as soon as possible. So we've been working, typically we work with Sal to develop the grant application. We already had your educational specifications complete, all the funding authorizations complete. It's really uniform ed estimates, a lot of technical support from Silver Petroselli and ourselves to Sal to submit that application, and we're just about ready to submit that. I believe we're going up there September 11th with these documents upon your approval to request permission to bid. And we expect that to be fairly short turnaround time. We can't go out to bid until they give us that permission. So in addition to the approval tonight, we had approval from the building committee on August 20th, I believe. And we're procuring signatures from the 4 required code officials, building official, fire marshal, health, and 504 ADA officer as well. So with those approvals and the approvals tonight, we'll go up to the state and seek approval and then get out to bid. Hopefully, I think at the end of September is what we're shooting. I expect there to be a quick turnaround from the state and go out to bid. And then over the next approximate year, due to occupancy of the building and the nature of installing the HVAC systems, we'll have to take down seal and tiles in select areas and work in select areas, the gym, cafeteria, to install ductwork, and then ultimately in this next summer bring in our rooftop units and fire those up and get those started and commissioned in the following summer.
We'll bring it to the board for questions. Mr. Asai?
So can you just explain really quick as a recap? So we've got the original budget was 3.2 million. And I know we were taking into consideration the FEMA cap and everything, but total project costs at 2.123. It seems like this number is significantly lower than what we talked about by just eliminating some of the stuff that we did last time. Can you just give a summary really quick of what from the original plan was taken out of here to get to a number $1 million less than the budget?
That one, Nick, I think what you're looking at is from Roger Sherman, the estimate from Silver Petroselli. I'm assuming it looks like this document right here.
Yeah.
2,123,800. So that what this is actually it says total project, but it's actually the cost estimate for the work that we're seeking to receive approval on from the state. It's not the total project budget's still 3.2, but for this phase of the work itself, is, and it actually includes some construction contingency at the bottom, 58,000. That's owner's contingency. But this is we have to go to the state with a cost estimate of the work and certify to them what we believe it's going to be and show that it's within budget. So that's what that number is representing there.
So under this last general conditions, escalation, construction contingency, is that generally reimbursable?
Yeah, it'll be prorated. Depending, because in all these divisions, you see fire suppression, you see plumbing, mechanical, electrical. There are in a few, in some like architectural example, painting. Painting is typically not reimbursed. By then they consider that a maintenance cost. Roof patching and connections, they may push back on that. That's a negotiation that we'll have to work with the state with to justify as much as we can. They are gonna make some ineligible, and it's something we have to partner with them and work with them. We're trying to achieve as much as we can on the larger, rooftop units, ductwork, in utilities. So what'll happen is whatever they determine ineligible in here, there'll be a certain percentage of the general conditions and overhead. It's like a prorated amount. So say if there's 15% of the basic trade work, they'll take 15% of the general conditions and overhead, whatever that will be, and we'll base that upon the bids. When the bids come in, we'll right size those. But we're gonna, when we go up there on the 11th, we're gonna have to have a discussion with them exactly what they're gonna want to consider ineligible. But the good news is, I think we think a majority of it will be.
So can you tell us what the total cost estimate is of the total?
So, yeah, I would.
Because my concern is that I see 3.152, but a FEMA max cap limit of 2.6. So I'm just confused on, or if you could clarify how we go $500,000 over the FEMA limit and still be okay.
So, I think I can handle that one. There are a number of things that are excluded from
Perfect.
the FEMA cap.
Can you list
Sure.
those?
Site work, basically anything outside of the building, all the soft costs, and that's, I mean, I think that's generally it.
So according to this, we're right now, where we stand now, we're roughly $20,000 under the FEMA cap.
Correct. And that is inclusive of about $138,000 of contingency money. So if we don't use any of the contingency, we're up to about $160,000 under that cap. So we have
Okay.
some
But
wiggle room there.
What if we run into issues or barriers as we have on other projects? That $20,000 number seems a little small to me to be a buffer. And if we did get to the point where we went over, what does that mean?
So we have formatted the documents to include two add alternates.
Okay.
One for the removal of the stage,
Mhm.
which I understand is not desired by the board unless we are putting a stage back. So that will likely be an add alternate that is not acted upon. So, and you can see that is on line number 9. That's about $92,000. So, and then the other add alternate is the renovation of the bathrooms by the gym to the tune of about $55,000. So we've built in those mechanisms where we could not act upon those areas of work should the prioritized scopes of work come in over budget.
So when I hear bathroom upgrades as an alternate or add, I get a little concerned based on other schools and us pushing bathroom projects off for years and years and having problems down the road. Can you explain what the upgrades just quickly would be, that if just to put at ease maybe mine and others' minds, that is it just replacing toilets or is it actual plumbing in the wall and the floor?
There will be some rough plumbing work associated with making the bathrooms ADA compliant, but to my knowledge, and maybe Sal can speak in more detail on this, it's not that the plumbing work is in disrepair or needs to be replaced. It's more of making these particular bathrooms ADA compliant and giving them new fixtures and finishes.
Okay. So finally then, I'm just going to say, so after our initial discussion last time, so it seems like the stage is still a go
The
at this point.
The stage removal is currently in the documents as an add alternate, but it is not my intention or the intention of, I think, any of us sitting here to actually enact that under the eventual contract.
Okay.
At this point, I think because the architect had already done a significant amount of work in there, we chose to keep it in. If nothing else, I think it gives Sal a little bit more real number for his budgeting on phase 4.
And phase 4.
Good segue.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I don't think there's anything official yet, but that statement was assuming that the items that were removed from phase 3 in order to get it on budget would be added into an eventual
So the reason I ask is this was originally pitched as a 3-phase project, and as we looked at it and we've had these discussions, it looks like a 4th phase is a potential down the road. So is it just these?
We're going to talk about that with the capital waterfall, correct? In terms of phase 4 and what will be included in that. So maybe we just hold that portion
Got it.
of the conversation, because that is more for Mr. Papa George and not for the building committee right now.
Thank you.
Mrs. Maxicanelli?
Just a very simple question. Since we have voted on the ed specs and the revision to the ed specs, I'm unclear on why we're voting.
Sal?
Hi. Part of the excuse me, part of the process is the chairman or chairwoman has to sign what used to be called the EDO. It's called an SCG 042 form that the plans have been approved. The building committee approved the plans. This board has to approve the plans, and the superintendent also has to sign off on the form so that we can meet with OSCG&R to get their approval of the plans. They don't want to touch it if all these entities haven't approved it themselves.
The key being this is a formality.
This is formality. Yes.
This is a formality, but since we were doing it and we haven't had an update and there have been some changes with the project, I thought it was a good opportunity just for the board to get an update as well, but that's it. So if anybody has any other questions?
Just to summarize so I make sure I understand the budget. We originally approved this budget as a $3.2 million total budget. We recognize that there's about 560, I'm asking if I'm understanding this correctly. There was about $560,000 of costs that FEMA does not include in their cap, which got us down to the 2.6 million construction budget that would be FEMA allocated. And so we're on budget because we're within the 3.2 overall and we're within the 2.6 FEMA max limit. So we're in good shape.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. This is a voting item, so we're going to go to the public. If anybody would like to give public comment on this before we vote, ask you to please come forward, state your name and address for the record. Seeing none, back to the board. The Board of Education approved the signature, the Board of Education approved the Sherman project plans as enclosed. Motion passes 9-0. All in favor? There we go. First read of student survey for Sacred Heart Project. Dr. Priest?
Yes.
Mr. Cummings, do you want to give us a
Yeah, I'll give you
a quick recap?
A quick review of this. Dr. Price is familiar to many of us as the
Sorry.
one of the former housemasters at Fairfield Ward High School. And in, I wouldn't say her retirement because she's probably more active now than she ever was. She is now a professor at Sacred Heart and spoke with Dr. Tracy when he was serving as interim about a survey she'd like to conduct with our students. I would also point out that Dr. Price is probably best known to us for her most recent work with the diversity group that she founded and has continued to work with at Ward, which has really been an excellent, shining example of work in the Fairfield Public Schools. So I'll turn it over to you and the questions that the board members might have.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it, and I loved my 10 years at Ward, and I miss you all. I left a year ago in July. I was a housemaster there, and while a housemaster there, began doing a lot of research on the issue of leadership in suburban schools and how we can best meet a population that's becoming very diverse. Most of us, truthfully, in our leadership programs did not have a lot of formal education in this, and so we're all working to improve our knowledge and our skills. So as a housemaster and a leader in the district, I began to do some research. Over time, I had some faculty join me, and we also invited students and parents, and we created a group which was originally called the Achievement Gap Task Force, but is now called the Fairfield Ward Voices for Equity. And it's about 4 years old, and we use our knowledge and student voice to train faculty at Ward on how to work well with diverse populations. So for the past 4 years, we've done at least 1 to 2 professional development sessions every year for our Ward faculty. We've also presented at NEASC. Our accrediting body has a best practices conference. We've brought kids with us to present what we do there. And we also did a national redesigning high school program in San Diego. So we've been very, very active, and upon leaving Word, I was delighted to have them ask me to stay and continue to consult for the group. So this research kind of comes out of that, because one day, the year before I left, I overheard a conversation of some of my students while we were working on individual projects about a situation with their bus. I had been writing a chapter of a book on suburban leadership and equity, and the issue of sort of social spaces and how students in suburban schools often kind of get segregated, whether it's in classes or social spaces. I was writing about that at the time, and I overheard some students talking about their bus and how it was predominantly students of color, and it was very full, packed, unusual in Fairfield. And they were kind of talking about that and how it was different, you know. And so I kind of said, do you mind if I sit in on this? And I was listening, and it sort of gave me the idea for looking at the bus as a social space for students who have to take the bus to come to school. None of these students really wanted to take the bus, but they needed to for whatever the reason. So that's where the project comes from. So basically, what I'm looking at then is students. What I was looking at is opportunity gaps as a research topic, and the difference between an opportunity gap and an academic gap is, academic is very clear. You look at standardized scores, you look at how students achieve in reading, writing, math, science, whatever you're looking at. But an opportunity gap has to do with the other things that benefit students into their college and career readiness. Things like, are they taking high-level classes? Are they involved in extracurriculars that are prestigious and that build social connections for them and fill their resume? This is where we see across the nation a very big divide between students who are income challenged and not, and students, regardless of their income, students of color and white students. And so I began to think about the bus as a social space. And I know when I was in high school and I did have to take a bus, it was like a 45-minute ride. So when you do the math, going back and forth to school, you could be spending a lot of time on your bus. Now, students get a lot of information, particularly first-generation students whose parents didn't go to college, from their peers. And that happened to me because I had one parent that went to college, one that didn't. And my parents didn't talk a lot about college, so I didn't get advice from them about courses to take or AP or anything like that. I got it from the peers I was with who kind of knew the system. They knew the playbook. And I learned it that way, and I had some teachers who also made sure I had information. I was lucky. They tapped me and they said, you need to be in this class. You need to be doing this. You need to be that kind of thing. So what I thought about is, if we have situations, social spaces that kids spend a lot of time in that are not diverse, with a wide variety of kids who have a wide variety of information, what is the impact on them? Is there an impact? Does it impact their knowledge about some things? Does it impact their self-esteem or their feelings about themselves as students? So what I'm looking to do is to interview a small group of students. When it says survey on here, that's slightly inaccurate. It's actually an interview of a small group. I'm not passing out a paper and pencil survey to a group of students. What I would like to do is I'm interviewing some students who graduated already, so that you don't have to worry about that. They are off campus and graduated, they're in college. I will interview some of them, but I also want to interview about 6 to 10 students who were on the bus last year, okay, most of them are minors. But I would like to do it on school property because they have to ride a bus to meet them off school property involves some work for their parents. So for convenience reasons, I was hoping I could ask them the questions I gave to you, use perhaps I'd speak with Mr. Cavanna, the principal, the headmaster, and figure out like a room that has a window or door. For safety reasons, I don't want to be like alone in a shut room with kids. I don't think that's good practice. So, a room that has windows or whatever where we feel we're kind of like out there. And then I would record their answers, and I would make some conclusions based on that. The work would be entirely anonymous. I don't intend to use, obviously not student names, the bus, the town, the state. I will refer in my research to a northeastern state. That's as far as I will go in terms of identification. There are 2 pieces of information that I would like to have that I would need your permission to use, and there's a reason for it. This is a perception survey. So there are perceptions of all the kids on my bus are almost all students of color. I would like to be able to say, by getting that information, that the racial breakdown of the bus or the ethnic ration is such and such. Not by individual student. I don't need to know their individual information, but percentage-wise, that is correct. 80% of the students on the bus identify as students of color, or whatever. And I would also like to have the percentage of students who ride the bus who are on free and reduced lunch, because I think that's going to come up. And I can't corroborate that. What I did do is, on the permission slip that you have, on the flip side, it asks 3 demographic questions on the permission slip, which they are under no obligation to answer. But if they would, that would give me more information, but it doesn't give me the big picture of the bus. So, I can do the survey, I can do the research without that information, but it's helpful when people are giving you their perceptions to be able to corroborate whether it's accurate or not. It doesn't mean that their feelings are any different or that their reality is not their reality, but that would help me. But I would need your permission, and the people at Ward, I still have relationships with them, I've been consulting with them, are willing to help me to get that information. Not student by student. I would not be saying, oh, John is on free and reduced lunch. They would just give me a statistical average, 80% are, or whatever it might be. So that's that. Any minor requires parental consent in writing, so there's a form there, and I need consent from the student. So I would get 2 consent forms from each student, and it's been said multiple times, and I would have a little script that I read beforehand reminding them that if they don't want to answer a question, they can, and then they can back out of the research at any time. They don't have to. There's no compensation, except that I do want to give the kids a gift card for their time. So I'll give them like a $10 gift card to a local, Fairfield coffee shop or something, Starbucks, or whatever. I would just give them to that to thank them for their time. And so again, the results would be part of an article I would write that would hopefully be published by a journal, and that usually takes between 6 months to a year for that process to even happen. So it wouldn't even be published in the really near future, but and I think it would be very useful to leaders of suburban schools to get them to think about these social spaces and what do we kind of do about areas that are kind of segregated. And it's by no intent, I don't think. I think some of it is housing and where kids are, in the case of a bus, how kids are districted on a bus. But nonetheless, if you are spending 40 minutes on a bus every day in the morning and every day in the afternoon, conversations go on, and I wonder what is the impact on on their sort of their social connections and their ideas and what information they have that will help them with college and career readiness in high school.
Okay, to the board, Mr. Dwyer.
Actually, I've met with this task force, and they've been operating for 2 or 3 years and have done very good work at Ward. And you quickly glossed over the trip to San Diego, but that was in recognition of the work that this school district is doing at that national event, so you should be congratulated on it. In the reading I've done, too often plans are made by the majority population on how to integrate the non-majority population into a school system, and one of the key recommendations they make is you should listen. You know that phrase, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, and that you should listen. So I congratulate you for a study that is intended to listen to the perceptions and concerns of students. Thank you.
Ms. Jacobson, followed by Ms. Drazen.
Thank you for providing the list of questions as a follow-up. That was very helpful. And I was just 2 quick things. I'm sure this has been passed through Mr. Cummings and Colleen, and whenever legally this is all fine by you two as well, right? And then the second piece is, since we now have the questions I'm just wondering if it's possible in your forms that you're going to be using for this, if where it says in a couple different places what kinds of questions will my student be asked, could we insert that a copy may be available at the high school office if they want to see that, or something like that, just so they know that if somebody wants to preview them, that they can be available for them? Is
Yeah,
that
I can
possible?
speak to the institution. This survey, by the way, the whole project has to be approved by Sacred Heart's Institutional Review Board, but I cannot go to them without saying I have school approval. So it starts with, do you have approval to do this on campus? I can ask them about that. The only concern I have is that I don't want them to discuss with their children answers, because then it influences. So generally, when you do this kind of a survey of questions, you don't provide them advance, because it gets people sort of planning their answers. So I'm a little concerned about that. I mean, I think if a parent was that concerned and wants to talk to me, there's contact information, and I could probably give them a little more information. And if they really don't want to, if they're uncomfortable, that's okay. They don't have their child. I understand, like, people might be nervous and that. One good thing is that a lot of these kids kind of know me. They kind of know who I am. So I'm not a stranger coming in from a company that, they know a little bit about me, but I understand what you're saying. I'm worried about sharing the exact wording of questions, but I would, if a parent contacts me, I could give them a little more information.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me if I just interrupt. I think we'd have some question, and we'd have to review this about the release of information about free and reduced lunch. That would, even to a bus group, could be a invasion of privacy and violate the law. So
Right.
Colleen and I will need to look at that further.
And I did call the Department of Education about that, and you guys can do the same. And I spoke to the person in charge of this, and he said it really is a local question. It is, obviously protected information, but in the case of something like this, it is not unusual at all for a school to do that, to provide it in. And again, I am looking for aggregate information, not about individual students. I don't need any names.
Right.
So it's really up to the board, but again, you will want to check that out, obviously, with the Department of Education. As an administrator, I'm very well aware of FERPA and all those
You know
things.
how
So
tough
I
that
called
information
first to
is.
say, can I even ask for this information? And they said, absolutely. I mean, they have to do it too, so, yeah.
Any other questions, Mr. Asel?
You answered it. I was just at a question if this has gone through IRB yet, but
No,
you're
it's
saying
going
it
to
has not.
go through RIB. I have sent the application in for the overage students because they're not a protected group and it doesn't involve the district. But as soon as if I do get your permission, I'll be submitting it immediately because I would like to get this done, like by the mid-semester, so I can, because I've got to, it's a lot of work and I have to send out, I got to give them time to consider it and so.
So this is something we vote on next meeting, correct? So we'll get the answer from Mr. Cummings on the, okay, thank you.
Do you need a minimum number of students to agree to be interviewed?
Well, I think that I can rethink the survey if I don't get 6, because even asking a couple of people for their perceptions is helpful, but it's much more helpful when you get 6 or 10 students who can give me, and if there was more than 10 that really wanted to, I'm happy to interview them, but I am trying to keep it somewhat small, and it's time consuming for them and time consuming for me too, so I'm not sure that many students will say yes. And hopefully I can get 2 or 3 graduates that will be willing to, so altogether for the survey, hopefully there'll be, for the study, hopefully there'll be like maybe 15 students, which is, a good number of perceptions to look at, so.
And would you be sharing the paper after you write it with the district?
Oh, I'm absolutely happy to share the paper with the district. And, I might be able to share some general information, like with Mr. Cavanna, since it is a Fairfield Ward bus. But what I can't do is give too much information, because it is supposed to be anonymous. And that's only with the understanding that you guys keep it anonymous and just for use in the school to make things better. My question again is, what social spaces do kids hang out in that actually could be a benefit to them or might actually not provide them access to diverse information they need in order to be, and so it might just help them to think through other spaces too. The bus is just one place.
Well, absolutely, which is why if you're going to do this, we'd love to have that information, even if it doesn't
Sure.
come to the full board, but to come to.
Absolutely, if I hope I get published, and I will absolutely send you guys copies if I get published, so.
Any other questions? Okay.
All right,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much, I appreciate it.
First read of proposed text for international business course. Ms. Gottesman, or do you want to give any
Give a
opening
brief
comments on
introduction
this?
because I want to take the opportunity to introduce Ms. Gottesman. Ms. Gottesman is serving as our interim deputy superintendent, and I want to welcome her to her first Fairfield Public Schools Board of Education meeting. With her tonight is Robin Terwilliger, who is our curriculum coordinator for the business department. Robin presented in the spring, as you remember, on the business curriculum update. They're here to present a textbook. There's the memo, I think, in your board packet pretty much covers the basics of why we're bringing this forward. I want to stress this really is a supplemental text to the new International Business course. But I'll now be quiet and turn it over to you.
First, I'd like to say thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here and be part of Fairfield for whatever time I'm here. I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage. I started 7 days ago. So I think Robin wrote this before I arose to this chair. But I didn't even know who Robin was when I saw her name on the letter until she walked in, and then I said, "Oh my God, Robin!" So this state is pretty small, and we tend to know a lot of people. So Robin will speak to the letter that you have in your packet.
I'm Robin Twilliger. I'm the high school business liaison, and the business department proposes the adoption of the text "International Business" by DeBlay Scott. Published by Cengage in 2011. The book was chosen because it aligns to our curriculum and to the Fairfield Public Schools vision of a graduate. The content can be formatted so that academic expectations can easily be integrated into common assessments and created to support student growth. The text will be used as a supplement material in addition to other materials such as texts, videos, and online material relevant to course curriculum standards. The book introduces students to some of the fundamental concepts of the international studies, major world regions, and selected countries. With those regions are discussed with respect to the people, their physical demographics, cultural, political, and economic characteristics. Several concepts and global issues are explored, among which the physical environment, conflict, global interconnections, and with the movement of goods and people across borders are central. This book will emphasize contemporary events, particularly as they relate to the fundamental themes that are covered in our course. Our committee consisted of myself, Diana Rainho from Fairfield Ludlow, Allison Danzo from Fairfield Ward, and Deb McGugan from Fairfield Ludlow. We looked at 3 books, and we decided that this was the best book to prepare our students for future courses and the continuation of this course. And we really enjoyed this book because it had great concepts to springboard other activities from. This book is in high demand. I think Fairfield are trendsetters because international business is a really popular course this year, according to the book reps. So this is the one that we have chosen to use in our classroom.
If there's any questions, and this is a first read, obviously. Do you have the text with you?
Yeah.
The text is here, and we will make this available as a process in this instructional division of central office for parents who are interested in looking at it before the next board meeting.
Mr. Peterson.
That's really my fundamental question. There's no online link for us. You have to look at the physical book. And I guess the follow-up question is, are we just buying the physical book, or are we also buying the rights to online content?
Great question. So there is an online link, but you have to have the book to get the online link. We are not purchasing the online textbook. We prefer the hardcover textbooks. They work better in our classroom. We can share them among students, and it's more cost-effective to have the hard physical book in our rooms.
But that's not going to be an impediment to have a text in class that a student wouldn't be able to access at home. It feels opposite of the way we've been moving in general.
Well, it's a supplemental material, so we are going to be using other things. Like I said in the curriculum review, business is forever changing. So what comes up today might be different next week and each semester by semester. So we will be posting things on Google Classroom. I'm going to be teaching it, and I'm lucky to be teaching with Diana Rainho at Fairfield Ludlow. So we actually spoke this morning about pulling things together. It's a first time for running the course, so we're really looking to change it semester by semester as issues evolve.
Sure. And so your basic point then is that this text contains information that's evergreen enough to have a reasonable shelf life without needing kind of, as an online text would be.
Absolutely.
Yeah, all right.
It's more cost effective, and it has a lot of the concepts, the core concepts that we need that we use other materials
Great.
with.
Thanks.
I'd like to point out, I think Mr. Cummings said in the beginning that this is, and you've heard before, this is supplemental. It's not a primary textbook. So the more resources we can have for the students, the better. But it's not a primary.
Mrs. Gerber.
How many copies are you?
We usually order 30 copies.
Total for
each school.
Oh, okay, so 60 total.
Yeah, so hoping that we don't have more than 30 students. We do like to order a little bit extra in case somebody needs a copy for at home. If they have a request to have a copy at home in their IEP or 504.
Okay, and what would the cost be?
I believe
Well, we're not
there's-
voting on it
yeah.
tonight, so if you could just get that.
I believe they're $70.
Each?
Each.
Okay, so 70 times 60.
Yeah.
I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to do that.
It was like,
Yeah.
yeah, I'd have to get back to you with that. I apologize, I don't have that.
Okay. Okay, great, thank you.
Mrs. Maxinelli.
That was my question, but just for that 4,200, is that, I don't recall, is that, did we already have that as a line item that
is
we
in- that
assumed
is-
was going to happen this year?
That is in budget, yes.
Okay, so we're not carving money away for this.
No, we are not. Thank you for asking the question, though.
Anyone else? I think we're good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll see you at the next meeting.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Hatz is here?
I saw him.
Yeah, there he is.
Update on high school grading. Mr. Cummings, do you want to give us an intro?
Absolutely. So I would like to invite up Mr. Hatzis, Mr. Cavanna, Ms. Gottesman, if she'd like to join them. At the board's request, and as follow-up to conversations over the course of, it seems like all of last year, we had conversations about the grading practices at the high school. We spent some time this summer building the responses to those questions and are here tonight to present the findings from the work that was done last year at both of our high schools to look at grading practices in an attempt to reform some of those practices as better reflections of what students are learning. So I'll turn this over to the work that Mr. Hatz did. We do have a presentation, so we're going to have to adjust our seating.
Thank you very much. As you're getting resituated, let me introduce Paul Cavanna. Mr. Ebling is off the hook tonight. And luckily for Mr. Cavanna, he kind of is too, because of the fact that he's just coming on board in July. So, but it's been great working with Paul so far this summer, and we look forward to doing a lot more work together.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to serve the Fairfield Ward in the Fairfield community as headmaster of Ward High School. And a special thank you to Mr. Cummings and Greg for their hospitality in my transition, and I'm honored to be here tonight. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks again for letting us present, and let's dive in. Just to give some context, as a former history teacher, I always feel it's important for you to understand, from whence we came. So therefore, back in the school year 2015-16, we started noticing a lot of trends in grading practices across both high schools. And under the direction of Superintendent Karen Parks, we embarked on some goals for the 16-17 school year. We wanted to extend the conversation about those trends that we saw with our teachers. So we all committed to doing that. We also wanted to establish a purpose of the grade. I mean, grades become such a focus of conversation at home, at school, and therefore, what does a grade really mean became something that we wanted to define. We also knew through the research that separating behavior and work habits from summative scores was an important thing. And without going into the details, I think that a lot of that conversation has been had. It was just the result of seeing the research and also having some speakers come to the district and talk to us about that. And we wanted to make sure that we did our research and that this wasn't something that was just based on anecdotal evidence. One of the things that we saw in teacher grade books was that students could have as many as 5 or 6 different approaches to how category percentages break down. So you could go to one class and maybe your summatives were 70% and your formatives were 20% and your class participation was 10%. You go to the next class, summatives could be 95%
no class participation, and 5% for formative, and so on and so on. And so, we thought that was difficult for the students to adjust to, and in fact, I think it was so varied that it often, went unnoticed. Like, that wasn't a topic of conversation, and it was never something parents complained about. I think in a lot of ways because they didn't always understand what the implications of that were from course to course. The problem also was that there wasn't consistency. I mean, it might be okay that certain content areas have made agreements that they are going to have a certain percentage breakdown, but what we were seeing is that even within departments there was inconsistency. So we reviewed the research. I have up here just the cover of an educational leadership journal. It became sort of our touchstone. Every article, if you're familiar with this journal, it is sort of the go-to for the American Association, the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development, sort of the ed leadership main research journal. And I brought with me also a pile of the of some of the books that we had used, and if anybody is interested, always happy to share those titles with you. But it was a year-long process. Before we really even started talking about changing anything, we just wanted to dive in and learn as much as we could. We did establish the purpose of the grade, and this became a touchstone for us. What we agreed to is that a grade is meant to communicate an individual student's achievement of the performance standards or learning goals as defined by the district curriculum. And if we understand that and we all agree that that is what a grade should do, what it starts to open is the question about when a grade communicates something else, whether it's their behavior or whether it's their performance on practice or other things, it starts to help us further define how the grade should be calculated. So this became sort of our working definition. We did some surveys of teachers. We did we shared articles with teachers. Just to give you a sampling of some of those, I put the question that basically asked the purpose of the grade if they agreed with that statement, and as you can see, it was widely agreed to. We also talked about the fact that whether student behavior should be reflected in the overall grade, and by 2 to 1, teachers did not feel that that was a practice that we should have. There was also a high degree of uncertainty, though, because I think that is something that, when it comes to grading, it's very personal for teachers, and when they get used to a certain thing, oftentimes it's hard to start to see other approaches or perspectives, and so therefore, we were doing a lot of professional development to try to help them see lots of different perspectives and different possibilities. Students who don't do homework but do well in summative assessments deserve a lower grade. And again, we had wide-scale disagreement with that. What often happens is that students who might get zeros on homework assignments but get 80s, 90s, even 100s on their summatives, we saw a massive drop in their grade due to those things. And I think teachers are starting to question if they're able to perform and demonstrate that they know what to do in the content in the curriculum, should we be punishing them with a behavior of not turning in their homework? So those are some of the things that we found out in the survey. So with that background, with the research, with the teachers' opinions, we had proposed to and follow through with initiating 3 different initiatives around grading practices. And I put this up here because I think what has happened is that they have been conflated under the common term cumulative grading. I mean, I've often heard people use the term cumulative grading to describe one of the other initiatives. So I wanted to just make sure and define for our audience, I know the board is very familiar with this, but just to make sure we understand that these really were 3 separate initiatives. 1, cumulative grading. 2, summatives counting 100%, and formative and behavior counting 0%. And then in the final mark of the year, their cumulative grade would count 80%, and the final assessment would count 20%, which also meant eliminating midterms. So we're going to talk about those 3 separately. So just for everybody's well-being here, the cumulative grading is defined by, it's a system for calculating a student's grade that counts each new assessment as its assigned weight,
in a cumulative fashion throughout the year. As many of you heard our examples in the past, with quarterly averaging, which so many people are familiar with. The example I often use is you might have had 3 large summatives in one quarter and 5 large summatives, let's say they were all worth 100 points in a different quarter, but when you average them, they actually become equated, so you're increasing the value of those 3 and decreasing the value of those 5 in each of the quarters by making them of equal weight in a averaging system. So it really was about a more fair grading system and also helping students know exactly what their grade was and not be surprised by the results of averaging. We learned a lot through this year. And so some of the lessons included that it was true that students, I think, appreciated that they always knew where they stood. There was a lot less student stress at the end of a term. There was always that rush, oh my God, I've got to get all my assignments in because at the end of that quarter, that's it. That was the end of it. But by basically having one single grading term throughout the whole year, there were conversations with the teachers about when they could get late work in, and it wasn't this, incredible stress period. For teachers as well, in terms of trying to cram lots of stuff in prior to a deadline. In some cases, we noticed that students were waiting too long to fix those low grades and zeros. They kind of felt like, I've got all year with cumulative grading, but then those lower grades came back to haunt them. We also noticed that teachers were being more careful with their weighting of assessments, which is what we wanted them to do. Consider what each one was worth in the big picture of the overall school year. You don't want, say, a 10, if you give a test and you make it worth 100 points, but then you give a very large project that lasts over many weeks, includes lots of research and outside resources, it would seem like you would want that to be worth more because you're asking more of the students to put into it, so therefore the total points should be reflected of that. We also thought teachers need to consider how to space out assessments and the impact of when they occur in the school year. For instance, if you're just starting to teach a concept early in the year, maybe those assessments would be worth a lower amount of points, and then over the course of the year, as students have learned what they needed to and are able to demonstrate and practice it, then maybe the assessments toward the end of the year would be worth more. Many teachers started to consider opportunities for retakes and redos. We also noticed that parents sometimes had difficulty because we still posted every quarter because we thought it was important for teachers, for parents and students to just be reminded this is where you are at this point. And plus, for reasons of eligibility for athletics, reporting to colleges, we needed to make sure that the teachers were sort of hitting the button to say this is where the student is at this point. But for parents, they still saw it as quarterly averages sometimes. So it really is just a snapshot of where you are at that moment. We felt the greater need for milestone formatives for larger projects and more frequent summatives. And probably the biggest takeaway was that early in the year when there are fewer grades, just mathematically, every new grade is going to show you more movement in that grade. However, toward the end of the year, when there were many grades already contributing, even if they did much better on an assessment, they would only see a small amount of movement. So the lesson that we're hoping students all learn from it, and the teachers will certainly impart this year, is you need to start strong. So now I'll move to the summatives, counting 100%. Again, the second of the 3 initiatives. And I'm just basically going to jump right into the lessons learned about this. We definitely saw less completion of homework. Students felt like it didn't count in some subject areas. Of course, what we were trying to help students understand is that when you practice, it does count in how you are going to perform on the summative. I think whether you want to say it's prefrontal cortex not fully developed, to understand consequences, or just from maybe a long history of students being so focused on grades rather than learning, what we noticed that they weren't focused on the concept that when you practice, it helps you learn it rather than, well, I don't need it for my grade. It turns out they really did. So we did see a high correlation between homework completion and better grades. And when students saw homework as meaningful, there was definitely higher completion. So I think that was a big lesson for our teachers in not just assigning sort of the, sometimes rote practice is needed in certain content areas. However, if students saw homework as something that was just busy work, they definitely weren't going to do it. Other areas in which homework never counted, because we definitely have this wasn't the first time for some subject areas that homework was 0%. Many of our AP classes never counted homework. Performance areas like art, FCS, and PE really didn't see much of a change over the course of the year from years in the past. And the teachers definitely expressed some frustration that if students were coming not prepared, it was really difficult to conduct class the following day. English teachers, if students hadn't read the material, they'd have to have backup plans. So there was definitely some stretches for teachers at times when students were not doing their homework. What we also found is that some teachers were, we created those categories, formative and behavior, to give feedback. If students were not turning in their homework, the hope was that teachers were putting in, the zeros in the behavior category. So therefore, parents and students could see, well, when you see what your grade is and you see this history, then basically you have an understanding of why the grade was the way it was. What we're finding is that it wasn't impacting anything. The students were not changing their behavior. Even when teachers reported over and over again that they weren't doing the work, it didn't change their behavior to start doing it or to see that impact. So over time, I think teachers less and less started giving that feedback in the grade book. They may have been doing it in the classroom or with communication home, but not directly in the grade book. So, so the students might have been losing out on some of that feedback through that process. So we wanted to look at how this may have impacted grades. And I think, we tried a bunch of different ways to try to show this to you, but we just thought we'd break it down as simple as possible and just look at the number or percentage of certain grades. So what you can see is for each grade level, a 3-year list of the courses, of the percentages of each grade. And what we saw was a decrease by about 3 to 5% in A's, and an increase of about 1 to 3% in D's and F's. By the way, we did not include grade 12 because what happens with 12th graders is a little bit unique. They once they start getting into colleges, many people like to call the senioritis, or they might have gone on internships, or they're exempt from their final exams. So we didn't think that 12th graders would be an accurate portrayal based on the grades. So we wanted to focus it on these 3 grades. The purpose of this slide and the next one is to just highlight that it didn't really matter. This wasn't a individual school-based phenomenon in either way. So we just called the schools green and purple. And you can notice the green school had an increase in the number of A's in 9th grade, but the purple school had a decrease of A's in 9th grade. But then if you just look at grade 10, the opposite was true, where the green school had fewer A's and the purple school had more A's. So again, this was a trend that we saw at both schools. I know that's often a question, so we wanted to just clear that up. So basically, if we summarize what we think the impact of the 100% summative was, is that student GPAs were probably slightly lower. Now, of course, every individual student's going to be different, and like I said, there was such a high correlation between the students that did their homework and the grades they got. But overall, we just saw a slight decrease, but we really feel like this was about the commitment of doing their homework and not seeing it as directly impacting their grade, although it certainly indirectly did. So we did, at the end of the year, as the board and the policy committee started to consider the homework policy, we did talk to teachers about if there were to be a change, The final vote, as you know, wasn't until after school got out, but in anticipation of that, we asked teachers, how did you, what would you like to do in reference to the categories and the percentages? So as you can see, we had about 20% of the teachers want to keep the system that we had last year. They felt that it actually made a significant impact on some student, on their perception of learning, and they wanted to give it another go. They felt like with lessons learned from last year that they could make some adjustments early in the year. Then we had about another 10%, somewhere in the range of a 95, 98% summative. But you can see a large number of the teachers fell in sort of the 90-10. They agreed that we probably should bring back a percentage in order to keep kids accountable, and that way, students would feel like it was impacting their grade more directly. As you can see, there were about 10% of, I'm sorry, I'll just put some percentages up here for you. About 13% of the folks who felt they wanted to not only bring it back, but have a higher percentage for formative and homework, anywhere from 15 to 20%. There was a really interesting trend. And just to summarize, about 75% of the teachers fell in that, 90 to 100 range for summatives. But the interesting idea that came out of this was those teachers who kind of thought out of the box. In looking at part of our mission being to prepare kids for college, where there is no formative and no homework that's part of grades, that maybe seniors, as a service to them, we ought to start to prepare them by having 100% summative, 0% breakdown. But maybe when they start in as freshmen, we can sort of work up to that. So a progression of a decreasing percentage counting for formative or homework. So I think this was an idea that might be worth exploring further. It would not have met the spirit of the board policy if the seniors had the 100-0, so therefore that wasn't an option we could consider. But so in the end, for this year, we are committing to having a 90% summative grade and a 10% category, which will include formative assessments, homework, and any other work habits. We're removing the word behavior from the vernacular. I think it caused a lot of confusion. We were talking about the behaviors associated with doing well, whether it's turning in homework or being engaged, but we thought work habits might have captured that a little bit better. Final section was about the final assessments counting 20% and eliminating midterms, and this has sort of two parts to it. The first is the midterm part. There were some mixed reviews there, and I think it really just depended on what course you took. We had many students report to us that they felt that January was much better than it's been in the years past. A lot less stress around that 4-day midterm schedule that we used to have, and the teachers really appreciated the flexibility of scheduling their assessments and not having to cram them in. It was always such a short time between coming back from New Year's and that long break up until midterms, when it was just breakneck speed to get everything in prior to the midterm exam. But at the same time, there were definitely some students who felt it didn't change for them because basically our curriculum didn't change. And therefore, it was sort of an obvious break point in all the full year courses that sometime in January you were wrapping up units, because that's what they had been used to for so long. So even if they had end of unit assessments or large scale summatives, students still felt like it was almost like midterms, because there were so many that kind of fell in the period of January. So instead of doing them all in 4 days, they were spread out a little bit further. In some ways, we might argue that spreading out was a good thing, because it allowed for the students, to have it more intermittently. And we actually did schedule semester finals during, designated days, and we told teachers you can't have any other tests during these days so that those students could have adequate time. I I think what students missed was with the shortened schedule during midterms, they had more time to study for those midterms, but they didn't have that in this case. And many AP teachers always used the midterm as sort of a mini prep for AP testing, so they still continued that practice because they felt it was a valuable prep for the AP test. With the finals part of this initiative, we saw a big shift. Instead of it just being about the exam, we called them final assessments, and they became multifaceted. So I think the focus on the final really increased the conversation and the quality of the types of assessments that were given, and in fact, many were broken into smaller pieces. So over the course of May and June, students might have had a performance-based assessment that showed their mastery of the work throughout the year, and then that counted toward the final assessment grade, maybe 10%, and then they also had the traditional sit-down portion of the final assessment during finals week, and that might have counted 10%. So it wasn't like everybody just went to one test counting 20%. It was often broken up, and I think we saw some really good discussion among the departments about what makes a good final, and that's something that we're going to need to continue. There were definitely students who felt increased pressure in saying like, oh my God, now it's stuff from the whole year I have to know, which of course that's the point, right? If you're going to show mastery to move on to the next level, you want to be able to show that you have spent your year learning the material from that course. Of course, there was also particular concern for freshmen who maybe had not had a large exam before. Okay, so in terms of data to help us understand the impact of this, let me just explain this. Basically, this is a graph that is showing us, if you compare a student's grade after the cumulative term, so the 80%, and then once they take the final exam, now they have a final mark. So we're comparing their grade before the final and the grade after the final. How did grades change? So this column here, I'm just going to focus on this one orange bar right here. This is 0 to 2. This bar represents the number of students who basically had, I'll use an example, an 85 for the year, and they either got an 85, an 86, or an 87. So they went up from 0 to 2 points between their end of term grade and their final mark. And so each of these bands represents a range. So this band is 2 to 4 points up, 4 to 7 points up, 7 to 9 points up, and then on the negative side as well. Now, even though this orange band in the middle is higher than this one, the negative 0 to 2, the subsequent bands are higher than their counterparts. So there's more 2 to 4 than negative 4 to 2. So that overall average was a 0.22% increase. Now, let me just identify the data here. This is prior to us doing the initiative. We wanted to make sure that we weren't doing something that was going to be too impactful. So we took the year before data. So, we implemented this in 18-19. We were studying it in 17-18. We didn't have a final yet because we were in the middle of the year. So we had to use the 16-17 data. We took the grades that kids got on the 10% final and extrapolated them to 20% and recalculated their grade. So the overall impact was an increase of 0.2%. Basically less than 1 point. That is averaging all the kids. Now at the time we only did the study with the Ludlow students. And some of the results you can see here, 50% of the distribution falls between basically up a point or down a point. 18 out of 10,000 fell by more than 10 points. So if I had an 85 at the end of the year, I ended up with a 75 or less. 18 out of 10,000. So I know we all love math. That's 0.0018% of all the pairings.
Okay, if you think about 5 to 6 pairing or 7 pairings per kid, it's a really small number. 48 of the 10,000 went up 10 points. Okay, now compare it to this year. And again, what we see is a very small overall impact. It did decrease. And again, even though this bar in 0 to 2 is higher than the negative, the subsequent bars are higher than their corollary. So we had a negative 0.22 decrease in the grade from, again, end of the year to the final mark after the exams were taken. 50% of the distribution once again fell between basically up 1 and down 1. And 46 students out of 20,000. Now this one adds both Ludlow and Ward students. We wanted to increase the pool and look across the whole thing. So this is the same chart from the previous slide. It is a complete and total coincidence that it went from plus 2.2 to minus 2.2, and the median went from plus 0.02 to minus 0.02. But as you can see, it was a similar distribution in overall impact, but now just slid slightly negative instead of slightly positive. So what were the lessons learned from that? Overall, when you compare all the kids and look at all of their marks, the overall impact of the final assessment is relatively negligible. Again, different from kid to kid, situation to situation. But when you look at the whole, we're talking less than 0.25%. In general, for every student whose mark dropped because of the final assessment, there was another student whose grade increased about the same amount. And that speaks to the median score of basically 0.02%. The shift occurred from very slightly positive to very slightly negative, and then I think that we can definitely point out that this trend can easily be explained by the homework completion problem, and that students were not as prepared for their summatives throughout the year and therefore may have had an impact on their performance in the final. What we know we need to fix and adjust and review is the pacing of the curriculum and assessments, making sure that students, the skills are spiraled throughout the year so they're ready for the final. We know that semester courses, we need to take a look at those, and the first semester has a different experience than the second semester, meaning that the second semester courses were able to be scheduled during the final exam period, but there is no midterm exam period for the first semester courses. We have to look at that. We want to make sure we're helping students prepare for the final assessments. I think a lot of measures were taken this year, but we definitely learned more lessons there. Ensuring high quality performance-based tasks and sit-down exams, and students focusing on content and skills throughout the entire year. That they know, now that they've had the finals under their belt, this is something I know I need to pay attention through all the year and not just wait to try to cram it all in at the end. So to summarize lessons learned, the next step. We need, when we roll out these initiatives, what we know is that we need to prepare students and staff in implementing these changes more. And what we'll do to do that is to apply the lessons that we learned from last year and increase the number of checks with our students and teachers throughout the school year to make sure that things are going well. We will obviously implement the new homework policy that was agreed upon in June. And we were going to do that by establishing the 90-10 categories in the grade books. And we will reflect this change in all of the syllabi and course descriptions. And obviously, we're all here to help the students. Ultimately, we will continue to refine the work to get better at what we do. Our Superintendent Cummings has proposed that we establish a grading practices committee that comprising of teachers and counselors from both high schools. Continue to research and attend conferences, gather feedback from students, parents, and teachers, as we did throughout the year last year, but to continue to make sure that we're hearing from them on their impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation and for getting us the information beforehand. I appreciate it. That was helpful. Mrs. Gerber.
Okay, I have a question. So, you know, I think one of the issues that I know I had as a parent, I know other high school parents had, is that these were 3 changes that were made all in the same year. And so the impact of the 100% summative, it says student GPAs were slightly lower. And then when you get to the final assessments counting 20%, you know, for every student whose final mark grade dropped, there was another who's raised. But for the students, perhaps their final mark dropped because of the final assessments counting 20%, plus they also were one of those students that their grade point average went down because of the 100% summative. And especially when we're talking about juniors last year who are going to be applying to colleges. And obviously, you know, while there are some things that worked out really well, there are other changes that you're planning on making, but those changes aren't going to help the children who are applying to college. So what steps will be taken to help those students who perhaps did not thrive with the new system as they're applying to colleges? Will there be a letter going with their transcript to explain that these changes were made last year and some changes are being made this year that might not show up on their transcripts? Just, I know I've had a number of parents reach out to me, and I know it's anecdotal and I don't have all the hard data you have, but you know, you're not going to hear people who are happy about something. You're only going to hear when people are unhappy.
Of course.
And so I guess it would be really helpful to get that information out, because there are a lot of anxious parents of seniors, including myself, who are really concerned at what this might do to student transcripts. And I know that's only one part of an application, having been through the process before, but it certainly is something, it's a number, it's something that people see, and I think there was a tremendous amount of stress for a lot of students last year, worried about, you know, because students were still getting midterms during midterm period, but they didn't have the extra time to study, and then a lot of stress about finals and what they were going to mean, and now they have the additional stress of if their grade point average was impacted negatively, now how is that going to impact them moving forward? So just if you could maybe give some information on that, that would be helpful.
Sure. I think anytime, and obviously all those stressors are very real, and everything related to the college process becomes a difficult, you know, big picture, because there's so much that we don't know. When students are applying to colleges, we don't know what factors they're using necessarily to make decisions. We hear more and more that GPA is less and less part of the discussion, depending on the level of school that you're looking at, and that they are looking at a much broader perspective. It's also deeply personal, because, you know, a student might be interested in liberal arts colleges, and those liberal arts colleges are going to be looking at grades one way. Another student might be looking at engineering, and you know, they're going to be looking only at specific types of grades on the transcript. So it's really hard. I think what we're going to have to commit to do, and I know we will, is in the process of the application. If there's a story to be told, right? If a student feels like there's a particular grade in a particular course that is going to be impactful, that's a conversation with the counselor that can be addressed in the counselor's letter to colleges to talk about a particular experience that they might have had. It's also it's hard to predict how any particular through mathematically, the students are going to be applying to colleges, and it's any one course is a very small part of the overall GPA over 3 years. So the overall impact for the last year may have been negative, but if they showed excellent performance freshman year, sophomore year, and then first half of senior year, that it's likely that could be compensated as well. But I think it's hard to say that there's going to be one thing that's going to be a fix for any of that. It's going to be more identifying the specific issue that you feel you might have and addressing that with the counselors so that they can address that in their letter. There really isn't a way to generalize the results for all students in a letter to go to colleges, because we had many students who still did really well. So we do put on the transcript that there was a summative grade, 100% summative, but that's not going to be the case for this year. So I still think we have to look at that a little bit closely to see how that can be conveyed to colleges. So.
Okay, well, I guess just to follow up on that, so I know a lot of it has to do with the students talking to their guidance counselors. Will this information be proactively presented to students and or to parents, just so that they know that that's something when they meet with their guidance counselors, they're going to bring it up? You know, if it is a specific concern of them, just to encourage them that you should bring this up. You should mention this when you're meeting with your counselor, or just so that people are aware of it, because I think that people are still trying to kind of figure out which way to go and what to do and who to talk to, and I think it would be helpful if there was some guidance given.
Yeah, we talked to the counselors, you know, when they came back and addressed this issue, and said that there might be some parents and students who have questions about it, and that, you know, they're fully prepared to be talking about that with their students. So I'll talk to Vanessa Montorsi and Karen Campbell at each of the schools, and we can, you know, we can devise a plan for that.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful, just because it would just put a lot of people's minds at rest, I think. So thank you.
Mrs. Maxinelli.
Just to follow up on Mrs. Gerber's point, what I would recommend, because this is across the district, if some standard language could be composed and given as a template to all guidance counselors, that here's a paragraph that described exactly what was rolled out last year, given to any guidance counselor, and to be used then in these letters of recommendation, because obviously those are very important, and that a parent could invoke it, or the guidance counselor, him or herself, could notice that, but so that they're not individually trying to compose this. I think it would help if those head of guidance could create that, coordinate between the two high schools, and then give it to the guidance counselors. And this way everybody has the same thing to work off of.
Right. You know, I think that one thing we just have to be careful about is that if we're saying something in a letter that, you know, universally that says, well, you know, we had done 100% summative, and so therefore student homework, you know, wasn't counted, would colleges, you know, interpret that somehow, saying, well, if they didn't do well that year, maybe it's because they didn't do their homework. So I think we just have to be really careful. We don't want to plant any ideas that may impact the student negatively, but, you know, we'll work on crafting something that, you know, will try to be explanatory, but yet not accusatory in any way.
Mrs. Jacobson.
So also a follow-up to Mrs. Gerber's comment. So I'll get to it when I ask my own questions, but that part about the starting strong. So we know what happened, and that for our rising seniors now, where there was some implications here, they don't have a lot of time, right? They're going to be applying EDs November and all of that. So I'm wondering if this message about first quarter and the start of school, like that you put in this presentation, that we've now kind of figured out that statistically speaking, this first get-go out of the gate is how we can maybe help a little bit with them. I'm just thinking out of the box based on your presentation. Because if maybe that message gets out to them that statistically speaking, if you can really, and also to our educators, what can we do in this first beginning quarter too? Because I know you were saying maybe in the beginning of school year you want to make the assessments worth less. Well, maybe we don't want to do that in this instance. Maybe we kind of want to give some early opportunities in the beginning where they're going to come out strong, like you're saying, as they go into this application process, that maybe that might help a little bit. I don't know, it's just food for thought, as in addition to what just Mrs. Gerber and Mrs. Maxinelli was saying, it's another proactive approach, maybe just food for thought for this first and second till Christmas, have you, as the application process.
Absolutely. I do want to just clarify too that mathematically, okay, how the students performed at the beginning of the year and the end of the year, it technically, well, at least I should say mathematically, it wasn't about, you know, the fact that they might have done really well at the end and it didn't impact their grade the same way it would have in the quarterly average. In fact, it was probably more accurate. However, it was the psychological factor that they didn't see the grade change as much. So I just want to make sure people understand that it wasn't about the timing of the year for the actual calculation of the grade. It was really just about the psychological factor. So the Start Strong is definitely a message that we're going to be conveying. You know, I meet with each class right at the beginning of the year, and we go through some things, and, you know, that'll be one of the messages. But the Starting Strong piece is really about doing your homework, you know, and doing the practice so that you are prepared well. The weighting is, I think, another conversation because the double-edged sword there is if you weigh things quite a bit at the beginning, then and they don't do well, then you could see precipitous drops and increases. So that's just something I think we'd have to flesh out a little bit more.
Mr. Peterson?
I have several comments and questions. First of all, thanks very much for the report. This is something that I was eagerly anticipating, especially since we spent so much time talking about homework and grades and policy in many meetings that you attended last year, which I very much appreciate your input in the process.
Thanks for having us.
One of the things that you led off with was the observation that parents and students were very much more familiar with the quarterly grading process than what you had proposed to do. I wonder if you could review for the board what steps you took to prepare students and parents for this change ahead of its implementation.
Sure. Well, first we needed to prepare teachers. So, you know, this is something that we had been talking about, as I pointed out, through a lot of the conversations with teachers about what cumulative grading would look like. And invariably, when we made the proposal in the spring of 2018, we drafted a document that we posted on the website. We also held parent informational sessions and allowed the parents to absorb it. And to be honest with you, the cumulative grading piece of it was the one that was the most widely accepted. And again, I'll refer to that as the mathematical component of it.
By teachers or parents?
Oh, universally by just about everybody. And I think even kids too. I mean, we also had student seminars where they came. We shared with them what the proposals were, let them, you know, put feedback in. I think that where the more concern was the 20% final. There were people who, you know, who thought it was a great idea because, you know, they thought that actually prepared kids better for college, and other people who felt completely the opposite. And they also thought like it might have been too much of a percentage. If you take that 0.22% change from a 20% and made it 10% impact, that would be like an impact of only, you know, less than 1/10 of 1%. We want students to understand the finals are important. And if we minimized it too much, then we felt that students would not take it seriously and they would blow it off. In fact, some of the data shows that there were kids who had, you know, B's and A's averages, but didn't take the final exam because they just thought, well, however, it's not going to impact my grade that much for me to care at this point. But anyway, back to your question. We had parent sessions, we had student sessions, we had documents online to help them understand it, and then over the course of the year, you know, we invited people, you know, to like prior to, like, say, the second term, we explained, okay, now in cumulative grading, be aware that you're not going to see, you know, like a reboot of the grade book. You're going to see grades continue on. So we included information in the course of the year so that they understood it as it went. And then prior to final exams, we also sent out documentation about, you know, the importance of studying for it and, you know, what the impact of the grade would be.
But nevertheless, you seem to have found that insufficient. And you say in your conclusions, parents needed more explanation of the snapshot versus quarter.
Yeah, to be honest with you, we provided the information, but I still think, you know, you never know who's absorbing it and who's not absorbing it. I think what the counselors said is that they often found themselves re-explaining how it worked because it's different from what they were familiar with.
One thing that you mentioned in terms of potentially lowering the value of a final, that students would blow it off. If that's the case, if you moved homework down to 0, why wasn't it easy to anticipate that they would blow that off as well?
Well, I think that there's a difference between what the purpose of homework is and what the purpose of a final exam is. If we are moving students from one grade level to the next and we're saying that, you know, you need to demonstrate that you're ready for the next course level, that's the importance of a final exam. Homework is practice. Homework is to help you build skills so that you could do well for the summative assessment.
I understand that, and we've been over this.
Yes, we have.
You and I have been in great detail. I would observe at this point that the kids, in terms of the homework, in some ways acted completely rationally. If there is no value to it, then why do it? The challenge that I see, the chasm that you're trying to bridge, is to convince them of a thing that homework has intrinsic value. And I understand that this is a step in that process, but one of the things that I kind of noticed too is that in your discussion about impacts throughout the year, teachers did not feel that kind of chiding the students had a lot of impact on them increasing their homework completion. Would you say that's accurate?
I'd like to think our teachers weren't chiding, but I understand what you mean. I know. I was just kidding around.
I understand.
Yes, there were pleads and begging and all kinds of things that occurred. Absolutely. And I think over time, what happened is that there was a certain segment of the population that started to see the value, and and I know that part of our purpose here tonight wasn't to get into the philosophic underpinnings of it all, but I guess I would just conclude by saying we're going to have 10% next year or this year. So we're moving in that direction.
I'm challenged by the conclusions of this, and I know we've made changes. I do find it disturbing that this system failed more kids. There are more Fs that were generated by the system. You say that D's and F's increased, C's also increased as A's decreased. And we can talk about grade inflation or whatever, but there is a significant negative impact here. And I think averaging out in some ways, one of the things that you do in your bar charts where you say, that for every student that had a lower grade on a final, there's one with a higher grade on a final. But in fact, in the 2018-2019, 48 kids had fell by more than 10 points, they had their final grade fall by more than 10 points versus 18 the previous year.
Right. Just remember, those are out of different denominators as well, though.
Well, I
so
know,
it's
but
30. It's really 36 compared to
This is the
43.
data that you presented to us.
Right. No, I mean,
And
but
I understand that. I understand that. And also we can discuss the fact that mathematically, because the final only counts for 20%, the changes are not going to be very large in any event. But the changes are negative.
I agree, and that I mean, the data is the data, and I would just, in terms of the 10-point differential, that would have meant that a student had over a 50-point differential from their end of term grade and their exam grade. When that happens, there's usually something else significant happening, and it may include something that is medical. It may include something that is social emotional. There might be other factors. I think part of sharing with that particular piece of data is to show that when it's only 18/10,000ths of a percent that students that happen to, that it wasn't, thousands of students who fell dramatically with a 20%.
No, but
final
these are
grade.
individual students. Let's not lose sight of that fact.
Right, but it's almost the same percentage the year 2 years before. Again, the 18 is out of 10,000, so it's really 36 out of 20,000 if you compare apples to apples.
Do you feel like you have the tools, given this last year of experience, to help students, and parents for that matter, bridge that gap and get to the point where they will be able to see the value of homework more clearly and the value of homework completion more clearly? Are you confident that that's going to be the case this year?
If we are, 10% is in the grade book, and therefore, if they are motivated by the grade, then that is something that is that's going to help them comply with doing their homework.
But you still have the fundamental goal. I never got the sense that you abandoned the goal of wanting them to see the value of doing the work for the work's sake.
Absolutely, you agree, and that is something that we will continually work with our teachers on. In providing that information. That will be part, I think, of the mission of the Grading Practices Committee that we had talked about.
Great. And just as a last point, I think we should see this next year as well. An update on this data.
Okay.
I'd just like to interject something here. Mr. Haas has just mentioned the purpose of the Grading Practices Committee. I think and I understand the presentation has set it up in such a way, but we're looking at this issue of grading and is distinct from all the other factors that we all know go on in the course of a coursework or 182-day school year. I think, too, what this also highlights is the needs for stronger SRBI systems at our high schools, the fact that we're talking about the value of homework, the development of assessments, the development of a task that kids are supposed to complete. Homework and grading has really become the crucible through which we're seeing a lot of other issues of reform practices that have to happen at the high school. So I don't want to lose, well, I understand and respect the necessity of this conversation. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that as we start to fix things, you know, fixing X isn't going to fix all the other factors. And I know the board is very well aware of that, but I think that that's just a reminder I feel compelled to bring back.
No, I appreciate that perspective. Thanks so much.
Mrs. Max Connelly.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for the report. I know we have been eagerly waiting for it, and one thing I want to say that I very much appreciate the candor with which you reflected on what had happened, and that I hope that that's part of this being a safe environment. Everything we try, I mean, I know in the classroom, not everything I try works. I don't have to say mine in front of live TV, in front of the Board of Education, and you do. So I do appreciate the candor that's within this report. One question that I'd heard rumored, and I'm curious if any of it formed this, is there a reputation of grade inflation? Either that Fairfield specifically, either of the high schools, Fairfield County in general, was any of this directed towards that? Because that's certainly something I have heard referenced as rumor. Cutting to the chase, in other words, the fact that some of those grades went down, in some ways, would that be considered, yes, that may have happened, but in fact, that's probably appropriate? I'll say the words and just
no,
turn
thank
it over
you.
to you.
No, that's a great question. I can tell you that there was never an intention in any way, shape, or form to target grade inflation in any of these initiatives. They were completely based on what we had learned from research and from what we believed was better for students in a variety of ways. One of which is the one I often, will scream into the hurricane, is the social emotional health of our children, and that the overemphasis on the focus of grading instead of learning is not setting up our kids for success long term. That being said, anecdotally, there were many teachers who felt that one of the impacts of what happened was that it decreased grade inflation. So I think it was more of an observation, as a sort of, ripple effect, if you will, or a side effect, but it was never the intention to target that in any way. This was all based on what we truly believed was good practice to help students become better at learning and, preparing them for success for the future.
Because, obviously I shared Mr. Peterson's concern about that increased number of failures. There's just the flip side of that it could very well be that student with a 59.5 who ended up with a 58, I'm making up numbers, of course, that may have been entirely appropriate as one example of moving down. But I just wanted to ask that. And then the rest of it, I'm just going to go in the order of the slides. On the second slides of a brief history, when you said this whole started the conversation with teachers regarding reforming grading practices. Can you actually explain what that means, grading practices?
So in the slide that talks about noticing inconsistency in the way that teachers were applying percentage weights, that's part of it. If we agree with the purpose of the grade is that it reflects how the content and the skills of the curriculum, there are certain grading practices that belie that. I'll use the example of extra credit. Oftentimes, if you're giving a random assignment that has nothing to do with the curriculum and it boosts the student's points and therefore they get a higher grade because of extra credit, theoretically that grade is not reflecting what they know in the curriculum. So, while that wouldn't make me very popular to say that you shouldn't have extra credit, if in fact we agree with the definition of a grade, then that would be a practice to look at. So, you know, it's those types of examples that we would do.
Okay, thank you. Okay, some of these questions I can skip now. Obviously, I also have a problem with a couple of the conclusions drawn because, unfortunately, the slides aren't numbered. I know. So I'm on page 4 of the handout that the board received because, obviously, with 3 initiatives being rolled out simultaneously, scientifically, it's a little bit hard to definitively attribute some of these changes to any one of them, and it could very well be all 3. One thing that I wanted to comment regarding the cumulative grading. It eliminates the skewing of grades. Allowing students and parents to know exactly what a student grade is. Was that truly an issue prior to tackling this? I mean, was that actually a problem?
In some cases, it was. I think that if we did a very in-depth analysis of teacher grade books internally, and what we saw were examples where maybe different sections of the same course, you might have one section that would, give, X number of assignments that was worth 1,000 points. And then another section that might give, X divided by 5 number of summatives and only 200 points in a quarter. And so depending on how the grade was calculated, there were very large inconsistencies. So, and if a teacher just decided to, this is sort of due at the end of a quarter, so I'm not going to have time to grade it, so I'm gonna make it into the next quarter, or vice versa. I'm going to cram it in and try to get it all done and grade it quickly to get it into this quarter. There was all this jockeying back and forth about where that assessment landed, and therefore it might have had either a much bigger impact or a lesser impact depending on how many other assessments were in that quarter. So therefore that really was an issue. I don't think it's somebody ever pointed to and said, oh my goodness, this is such a glaring mistake, but just mathematically what is fairer for the kids, and that if you had a great quarter and you had 5 assessments and you had a really bad one with 3, you're going to be skewed toward the negative there.
Okay, thank you. I'm on page 5 now. One thing that I know, part of these problems we talk about students and parents knowing where they are. I will say that just an earnest plea to you as the administrators is to be on top of the teachers about getting their grades posted. For the past few years, for example, summer work, I've sometimes not seen the summer work grades until November. And that's part that none of the, if we want students to be aware of where they are, and for parents to be on top of them, that is of enormous value. And that's where that snapshot in November, I know, provided an impetus at that point. But meanwhile, it's 2 months of flying blind.
Yep. I will say publicly that we are committing to teachers having a 2-week window to get grades posted in Infinite Campus, or 3 weeks if it's in particularly large project or paper, and that if that is an issue, that parents can reach out to us, and that's something we would definitely follow up on. We shared that with our faculties at the opening faculty meeting, so it was there. Yep.
I think that you need to share that with parents also, to realize that if it's been 3 weeks and you haven't seen a grade, that they should feel comfortable reaching out to you or their student's counselor on that, because I think many parents see it and then just don't say anything, and then you wouldn't know necessarily.
And I have more questions, but I actually have to take a segue to Mr. Cummings, because I believe this would be directed to you, is that there have also been issues raised to me regarding middle school. Mm-hmm. And why are our middle school students doing this cumulative grading? Because that feedback of a quarter grade, and middle school is where they can make mistakes. There's, aside from a couple of courses, and even then you can override, those grades are truly dipstick measure points. And let me start with this. Are they still getting report cards in middle school? Or
Yes.
is it now doing what the high schools are doing, where it's parents get the notification, hey, check in and you can get some comments?
I have to check on that. They should still be getting a report because I'm not aware that there's been any change in that practice.
Okay, and what about the cumulative grading?
Cumulative grading is only applicable in those courses that would count towards high school credit.
So if it's algebra, would be an example, but
Yeah, we-
otherwise the middle school is doing it the way it
We issued a
has.
clarification to the middle school today because my error, when I sent out the homework regulations, I didn't distinguish between the two. But I clarified that this morning with them because I just missed on that. The only courses that would carry the same grading practices, because they're going to count for high school credit, are those courses that would count for high school credit. So the algebra, the world language courses, those types of things. I will say, Mr. Hassett mentioned the grading practices committee. It will consist of teachers from 6-12 because if we look at that idea that was mentioned at the very end of the presentation about the progression, right? That's something we would really want to begin in grade 6 when they first encounter grades, and then work. If we think about eventually weaning them off of some of this towards 12th grade. So middle school has to be part of. Middle school can't exist in a separate world from high school, essentially, as we move forward.
But that also means that certain things that are appropriate in high school are not in middle school.
That's
like-
exactly right, and vice versa, yes.
Okay, so thank you on that. I obviously like on page number 5, the consider the opportunities for the retakes and the redos. Obviously, anyone who has read about the quality schools would love to mandate something like that, and while it's not practical or even possible in some cases, having that as part of the conversation I know is really valuable. How are you planning to, is it just, I guess, to the individual students or as well as those opening day meetings, that number 9? Again, that point about the starting strong, both because of the psychological impact, because it mathematically completely understand your point, but that's lost on an awful lot of students. Right. Is that just being communicated at that opening meeting, or is this part of a push out to the faculty, have this all be something that they're hearing in all of their classes?
Many of these lessons learned came from the faculty. I mean, through the surveys that we did at the end of the year last year and the conversations that we had in reflecting on the year, that was, I would say, the number one takeaway. And they all started with students felt like their grade didn't move as much at the end of the year. So I would say our 10th, 11th, and 12th graders have firsthand knowledge of that, for sure. But to your point, though, especially with the freshmen coming in, not only emphasizing it with them at the beginning of the year, but reminders to teachers. And I think that they all have that very clearly in their mind as they talk to their students about how to approach this school year.
Yeah, and to follow up on Mr. Peterson's point about wanting to see this data next year, just as a reminder, and obviously I know you know this, and also a reminder to the board, that the policy committee is going to ask to hear back from, basically, I guess, from the two of you and Mr. Cummings in, say, that March, April window of how has this gone this year? What do we need to look at differently to impact that policy? Because I'm sure that this conversation will be continuing. And I'd actually wanted to ask, how do you see that factoring into any of the PD that you do this year? I mean, they obviously got some good experiential learning last year, but how are you going to really narrow down and focus on that through any specific PD?
A lot of our professional development is going to be focused on the elements of our school improvement plan. So, and those elements, revolve around things like, high level, work in the classroom, like critical thinking and problem solving. Those types of activities that we're helping teachers understand take a tremendous amount of adjustment on their part in terms of what they share with students about, how their year is going to go. So we also have a school climate goal, and we also have an SRBI goal.
And
so
NEASC feedback.
all of those things. NEASC feedback. I'm still waiting for the report, by the way. So, so we had to move forward with what we thought was important, through our discussion, and so we'll get to that when we need to get to that. But the professional development, we try not to be ad hoc about that. We try to map it out in a way that's going to be meaningful and cyclical for teachers. But clearly, all the grading practices were a big part of our conversations with the grading practices committee.
We hope that there'll be recommendations that come forward, and through those recommendations, we're going to want more teacher feedback about any, if there are recommendations. So I think that will evolve organically depending on, how the year goes, if teachers see a change in the amount of homework that's going on, and then in the discussion and research that takes place in the committee. So we'll react to it as the need arises.
In addition, just to one point about that, the districts work with common assessments and how the creation of those common assessments really go into building the assessments, but also what are you using to then to assess them. So that's a natural kind of alignment to looking at the policy as it is right now to the work that moving forward, especially with the new graduation requirements for our ninth graders.
And perfect segue to my next question, which was that grading practices committee, is that where you're going to be focusing on the consistency aspect that the policy committee had talked about with you and which is in the policy?
I'll refer to the superintendent on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where we start to establish what are our expectations. What are we going to look at? Again, I go back to that progressive type of approach, and I'm not saying that that's something that'll come out of it, but that certainly is something that speaks to consistency. I think going back to the point I made earlier, when you talk, if you're going to discuss grading in a meaningful way, rather than something that simply is checking the boxes, right? As you should discuss grading in a meaningful way, what you're really talking about is best practices in instruction and assessment and intervention, differentiation, as it were. Because I always am mindful when I say intervention that we're not only focusing on the student who might be struggling, but we're conscious of the student who's moving ahead. And so the grading practices that we look at can't be check-off boxes. I think I want to just follow up on that question you asked about professional learning. I think for us to start to talk about grading practices and how they best reflect the learning we want students to accomplish, you're talking about in all likelihood, a multi-year professional learning goal that accompanies that, because you're talking about changing inherent instructional practices that have been in place for many, many years, and to better reflect the vision of the graduate and all of that. So I think this is an easy yes, but it's going to be a hard way to get there. It won't be easy to get there. If that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. Again, if there were a silver bullet, we'd all have it. So
yeah. I'd give them out free.
Yeah. Yeah. On slide 8, the impact of the 100% summative draws the conclusion that the students' GPAs were slightly lower. An issue with the homework. One question I have is that there is no mathematical data regarding the cumulative grading. And I know that was something that, as a parent, I had, with a few others, written a note to yourself and Mr. Ebling asking for data around just the cumulative grading, and that's not in here. And that is something I would be interested to Mr. Cummings in having run. In other words, we have a track of the student's grade. We have the 3 snapshots at the end of what would have been a first quarter, second quarter, and third quarter grade with what would have been quarter marks, although I absolutely hear your point, Mr. Hatzis, regarding what teachers can do right at that end of that quarter of moving something off. So that would be a flaw in it. But in terms of if that also had an impact on student grades, we have no data one way or the other if we did that. So we have all the grades in Infinite Campus. Again, I assume something from last year can be recalled. And so a student who was at these points during the year, what would that average have been if there were not cumulative grading? That data is not in here.
I think correct me if I remember this conversation with our IT staff correctly, but when we looked for that was not recorded at the moment. So let me actually make sure I understand what you're saying. So let's say the traditional mid-year break of January, right? That we compare January 2019, what kids had at that point as grades, to January of 2018, because in January of 2018 we recorded those.
No.
Okay.
I'm talking about one student who would have taken English, freshman English, and they had an average at the November snapshot point, who had an average in January, who had an average in March, who had a final average in June, done cumulatively. At those same checkpoints, had a class average, what if that final grade had been calculated using the old quarterly method?
system. And
The data just, there was no easy way for that to be extracted, because the new term grade includes everything up to that point. So it would have to be hand calculated, basically. You would have to you'd have to look at what assessments there were. So basically, it would be a whole lot of work for one kid, a whole lot of work for two kids. So there was no way to get a mass amount of data to really analyze that effectively. I mean, so that's in the time frame,
That's a great point. I hadn't thought of it that way. But
we did try for that. We did.
I would be curious if you took 5 sample students of a, typically in the A range, mixed BC range, but I think that would be useful to see, just taking, a sample size of 5 even, of what that looked like. Although I'm not saying that even if, I just think it would be good for us to know, although I do hear the points about in terms of the arguments in support of the cumulative grading. I am wrapping it up. I just have a couple of more.
Well, before I just wait, does anybody else have any questions about this?
Yes.
One more, and then Ms. Jacobson. We have just keeping, I know this board does not want to stay past 11, so when you're all going to give me dirty looks later, when
I've been waiting for this report.
I know you
for
have.
months, Mrs. Vitale. I have more than one more question.
Well, can Mrs. Jacobson ask?
She can go ahead. I mean, she's covering a lot of mine. That's good news, so.
I'll ask them quickly.
Okay.
And I am weeding out as I go. How did it impact grades that at the end of the first semester they only had 85 minutes for a final versus what happened in June? Aren't those fundamentally two different experiences and therefore two different impacts on the grade?
I wouldn't call them fundamentally different. Basically, for any of the exams that would have taken longer than the 85 minutes, they sectioned out the exam so that students could take it over different periods. So they still got the same exam. They still prepared with the same material. So it wasn't fundamentally different. It just wasn't necessarily all in the same sitting. So yes, that may have had an impact in some ways. Some people might think it was an advantage in some ways, but
I definitely think it could be an advantage. Yeah, no, I agree with that. Not all exams counted 20%. How could that have happened?
Not all final assessments counted 20%. So that in the example I used, where say a history class did a project where the students had to do research on something in the 20th century and how it related back, as a performance-based assessment, that would count 10% as part of the final assessment. And then the other 10% would be their sit-down test, at the end of June, where they're filling out multiple choice and essay questions. So there was a portion. Okay. So the exam portion, if you will, did not count 20% because they had another assessment included.
Okay. And then I think I can quit on just one last question. The question, Mr. Cummings, that I had sent to you regarding the graph on page 10, that's because in the email we received, it was a different graph.
Right. Yeah,
It
that was
wasn't-
in error.
so
Your email and Mr. Hatz's correction actually crossed in my inbox.
Yes. It's the same exact data and graph, it's just a different year and identifying it as one school. That was not in what it was sent to you. I realized that, we hadn't explained exactly what that data was.
Right, so in the course of that exchange, though, my question didn't get answered, which is, why were we taking 2016-17 data and not calculating it at 10%? In other words, doing it for what it was. The final exam impact in 2016-17 was 10%. So how did a 10% final exam impact the final average versus the 20% impact of 2018-19? That's what I want. This to me is a matter of teachers may have done something differently, or the cumulative grading, or the lack of homework. That's what this tells me. This graph tells me nothing about what was the change from 10 to 20%. How did that impact the final grade that appeared on a student's transcript?
I can tell you that answer.
Okay.
The answer is, and it's as simple as if you take the average impact of 0.22%, a 10% final would impact it 0.11%. So 1/10 of 1 point increase overall with all student grades when the final counted 10%.
Even though that there is then a midterm.
We had to, in order to see the impact of the 20%, the midterm was already counted in the full year grade. So the 80%, if you will, or the 90% that constituted the rest of the year, the midterm was already calculated as part of that.
So the change then would be both the 20% and the midterm being taken out. So there are two things going on there then.
Right. I can tell you that generally midterm grades lowered students' semester grades. I mean, if you just took the overall average, they often, students tended to perform better on their final exams than their midterm exams. And that's totally anecdotal and observational, and I admit that. But that's been my experience. So that was part of the decision originally to eliminate midterm exams, is that it created so much stress around a short period of time and lots of unfair cramming of stuff. Because students who were comparing the stress levels, they might have been thinking about, oh, it was nice to have a half a day to study. But what they forgot about was that week before, when every course was giving a final assessment in the course on top of preparing them for the exam. The papers, the labs, all of that stuff. It was basically 2 weeks of absolute stress. And I just for the heck of it, I looked at the attendance average in January and February, like sort of the post midterm exam. It wasn't as much as I thought, but it definitely was. When we had the exams, it was a little bit lower. There was a greater absence rate than it was when we did it last year. So
to be clear about those midterms, the spiraling benefit of actually having assessment to revisit their knowledge. Are teachers being told that they cannot have that as a January component to their course?
They're not being told that they can't have it. I mean, that's really a matter for the curriculum departments to analyze in terms of what they feel like their best practices are. Look, one of the things that we heard from parents in that parent night was that, how can you take away midterm exams? That's not preparing kids well for college. And our answer to that was, they're still going to have large-scale summative exams that could potentially be 85 minutes long. That's kind of similar to an exam in college. So many teachers, continued that practice as they thought was important as part of preparing kids. And plus, even if it's not called a midterm, doing a large-scale assessment in January helps prepare kids for when they're taking a large-scale assessment in June.
I'm agreeing with you.
Right,
I just wanted to
okay.
make sure that they were not going to be told, because I think
they're not stripping
the extent to which
it,
it
no.
happened surprised administration to a
Yes,
certain
it
degree,
did.
and it will be allowed to continue.
Yes, right. I think that's feedback, though, that we need to give to the department so that they can work with their teachers regarding an assessment timeline.
Ms. Jacobson?
I'll go very quickly. First, thank you so much for putting this together. I appreciate it. And it's very helpful. I just have she covered a lot of my questions and points, so I won't reiterate those, but I'll just quickly go through a few others that I had. So in the brief history, again, I'm going by slide, the brief history page, I know that you looked at different approaches that were happening in the grade book and also consistency between courses and departments or not. And my question is, when you looked at the end of this year in the grade book, was there a different type of inconsistency? Number of assessments, how many formatives, so in other words, we may have helped, did you find that maybe you helped consistency these issues in one way, but maybe created an inconsistencies in other ways?
So I would say that from the category standpoint, we went from, the Wild West to exactly the same, right? So there was a massive change from that regard. I think that one inconsistency that we might be able to point to is that teachers may have made the decision to include smaller type tasks in the summative category that one might categorize as homework. And what I want to be clear is that we never said to teachers, you can't grade homework, okay? What was said was that if you're simply grading the behavior of turning it in, that does not belong in the summative. If you are grading it based on the content and the skills that are being assessed in the curriculum,
and you can say it's a summative assessment because it's the result of a lot of instruction that's already been done. You know what a summative is, then it can go in the summative category. So they had leeway there. What I think that we saw is some teachers may have chosen to put things in the summative as a way to encourage the students to complete it. And and other teachers, you know, as a rule, did not do that.
Okay, so I'm thinking that not now, obviously, but with this year's data that you do now have available, if by digging into the differences between the numbers of assessments, there will probably shake out a place where it started to lean positive or negative, right? Like if you had smaller number, they were worth more. If you had a large, you couldn't move the needle. But somewhere in there, I would think that maybe in this committee that you'll be looking at that data is available and that there would be an analysis at that level that there is this kind of sweet spot in terms of number, right? Because we know that the differences, there were big differences in the number of grades that went in and how, even within the same courses, and how that shook out. Not a question for you to answer right now, but something that is food for thought that I break out. Thank you so much for the grading thing, because I was going to ask the same question about inputting grades. So if this process really does become where the grades got to be in, like, because it falls apart without it, really. So thank you for addressing that, and I'm super psyched to hear that. It was going to be one of my questions. Okay, so I'm going to skip a lot. I'm skipping a lot. I am. Let me just get to the thing. Can you explain a little bit more about what you meant about meaningful homework versus busy work homework? And we all know what busy homework is, but there's obviously some feedback that you got here that students told you about homework that they felt was meaningful. Can you just shed a little bit more light on the word meaningful?
Sure. I think that when, well, I'm going to refer to the homework policy. One of the things that was mentioned in those conversations was that students knew the purpose of it, that students understood the value of it, and you know, from the standpoint of how many points is this worth, but more importantly, you know, how does this help me learn? And when they made those connections, and you know, there are certain assignments that are definitely geared toward building toward a bigger understanding, or this end product is so big, how am I going to tackle it? And this particular assignment was very clear to them how it gradually got them there, that those were things that they didn't want to miss out on, right? So I think you tend to see in maybe subjects like math and world language when there's a lot more rote practice, which is necessary for them to, you know, process that information. You know, sometimes students don't see that as meaningful.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to have what their viewpoint on that was. The midterms, I'm wondering, I had the same question as Jen a little bit about the data in terms of the midterms, because as you said, some students did kind of have the equivalent of a midterm. And it was a cumulative, large January assessment, even though we're not calling it midterms, without the benefit of getting out early, still had to go to class, still had other homework to do for, et cetera, and others didn't have that. So I'm wondering, as we go forward and you're studying these issues, if you could break out those who did have that cumulative exam in the middle and how that impacted the final grade versus those who didn't. Because I mean, or maybe you already know the answer to that. That big summative assessment isn't impacting final grade at all, and therefore we should just forget all that in the middle, or it is helping them get better grades in the middle, and that we should apply that more rigorously.
I think that would be really hard to conclude, because there are so many different circumstances, right? If one student had several of those experiences, for instance, many of these students with multiple AP courses were the ones that were feeling it more in the month of January, whereas many other classes, they felt such relief. You know, kids who had different types of courses, they felt such relief because, you know, they might have had one in the first week of January, and then one in the third week of January, and one in the first week of February, and it wasn't really, and they weren't as they didn't feel that they were as impactful. because a lot of the teachers chose to have those grades just go in there wasn't like, there's not like a midterm spot in the grade book anymore. So they went into the term grades. So again, depending on where students were and what class they were in, that I think would be hard. We can take a look, and again, I think we can get some anecdotal data from the teachers on that, but thank you for asking.
Do we have, I'm going to fire my up. Do we have the middle school data?
For what?
For the cumulative grading from last year? Because that's not in this presentation. Can we have that? How did our middle schoolers do under this? It's like the year before to last year?
They, yeah, we can get that. I just don't know how long the timeline would be.
No, and I'm not saying immediately. I'm just saying in part of the process, because I think it'd be interesting to see if there was a bigger difference at the middle school level than there was at the high school level in any of these areas. And that should be available. And then the last thing I'll ask for, and then I will stop, is since we now have the 17-18 data for both FLHS and Ward, can we get rid of the 16-17 slide and put the 17-18 so it'll be an apples to apples? Because right now it's not really an apples to apples chart. So in other words, we have the 17-18 and we have the 18-19 for both high schools.
The 17-18, we were still under the prior system. And you know, again, it was just a matter of us trying to do the 16-17 data was trying to do our due diligence to look at if we extrapolate the 10% final and make it 20%, how do we see that that's going to impact? It will likely be very similar. And again, if we're looking at the range, even between the 2 years when there were different policies in place, we're talking about a 0.4 range of difference in the overall grades of students. So, you know, again, I use the word negligible, and you know, and anytime you put a lot of data into one place, it tends to, you know, generalize a lot. So, you know, the story is in the individual student, and that's really what we're after here, to make sure that we fully understand what the impact is for any given kid, depending on what level courses they're taking, what supports they need, and you know, what their history has been.
Okay, and just one last question, and I'm done. The semester classes, you said in one of the lessons learned, and one of things that you're going to look at is how the first semester courses take their final exams. Why is that particular to first semester only? And
as we were talking about earlier, because the second semester courses took their final exams during the exam period that was specifically set out. You know, like the last 4 days of school, where there wasn't that same and equal period in the first semester. There were several teachers who taught many semester courses, either 4 or 5 of their courses, and they felt particularly crunched. You know, to me, that opens up more questions about what's the nature of a final assessment, and, you know, does it have to be simply, you know, the big exam at the end? I think, and I mentioned in the slide, there were so many great conversations, and to me, one of the great takeaways of all of this is that the amount of discussion that occurred among the teaching staff and the curriculum leaders and administrators was about, you know, what does assessment really mean and what does it do? And I will tell you that, to me, I'm very heartened at the quality of those conversations and how that's going to impact how our students are assessed in the future.
did you notice any difference in the mode of
No,
final?
no,
Sorry.
that the last one was your last question. I'm going to thank you, and I don't mean to cut you off, but we still have to go through the waterfall. In the future, this is for you, Mr. Cummings, if you see a topic that you foresee needing a lot of in-depth conversation, especially something as important as this, that staff has spent a lot of time preparing, I do not like to cut off the board. If you think that we need to have a special meeting just to talk about this, please let us know so we can really just focus on that and not feel rushed, and everybody can have the opportunity to ask all their questions. Thank you. I really look forward to just the next steps. And my one question, I had some more, but how quickly do you see the grading committee getting established?
Our obligation is to get that going in the next month. We're going to meet on it in 2 weeks to start to formulate it.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Approval of the CSDE authorized signature change form for the Bureau of Health, Nutrition, Family Services, and Adult Education. Mrs. Munsell, you may recall we just did this for Dr. Tracy. It is the same thing. We just now need to change to have Mr. Cummings. Can I have a motion? Ms. Pitko, seconded by Mrs. Gerber. No public comment on this. Any discussion, questions? All in favor? Motion passes 9-0. Discussion, facilities plan and waterfall, Mr. Papa George.
Can I just, if I can, I just want to introduce this for a second. I spoke with Mr. Papa George prior to the night's meeting, just to talk a little bit about the waterfall. And just very briefly, I want to highlight, this is going to look different than the version you had seen earlier, and there's a couple reasons for that. I think one, obviously with Mr. Papa George taking over from Mr. Curran after a number of years in that role, what we see here is a reflection of a fresh set of eyes on this. But I think the other part of that is, more so than in the past, Mr. Papa George took a team approach with his leadership group around this, got more input than has necessarily been gathered in the past in order to make some determinations of what you'll be talking about tonight. So I just want to frame that, what you're going to see against that change. So, with that said?
That's it. Okay. So I don't know if the best way to do this is to open for questions, or if you'd like me to go through each project listed here, or I don't know what the format is.
Based on the time, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Do you have a question?
That approach would work.
Can you do a quick just recap just of major changes?
So major changes. I guess just running down the list real quickly. Fairfield Ward High School, the AC for the cafeteria, that's something that you've all seen in there before. It's been there for a while. The Fairfield Ward High School Music Suite HVAC Art Rooftop Unit, that was added this year based on some information I had from Mr. Cullen on his way out. We put that in there. However, just recently we've had this system evaluated by our in-house HVAC technicians and our subcontractors as well, and I'm being told that even though there was some supporting information to replace this unit, they don't feel that it is necessary. They were able to make some necessary repairs to it, so I'm waiting for a full report back. So that may actually be able to come off of the waterfall before it goes out to the town. Moving down the list, the Fairfield Woods Middle School elevator, excuse me. This is something that I'm sure you all heard about last year with the problems with the students and going outside that we had to stop. So it was something Mr. Cullen tried to get done this summer. However, it wasn't a funded project, but during the bidding process, we had a company come in, look at the elevator, and they were able to get it up and running for us, and we signed a contract for them to run the preventative maintenance on this elevator for the entire school year to keep it running for us so that we can put it out to bid properly with funding. Let's see. Mill Hill BMS controls, the only change there is the school. We changed that from Jennings to Mill Hill. The reason being is that the Mill Hill system is a FX60 system, which is no longer supported by Johnson Control, and the system went down on us over the summer. We are actually using equipment on loan from Johnson Control to run the building at this point. So they've agreed to allow us to continue using it throughout the year and maintain it. So we will have to upgrade that. The other side of Mill Hill, though, is if we can get the building committee to coordinate correctly with the construction efforts, we may be able to also either change that back to Jennings or remove it from the waterfall for this year, as long as they can agree that that would be a first step in their construction come early spring. Moving down, Osborne Hill, I think you're all pretty much up to date on Osborne Hill's roof. The cooling tower at Roger Ledlow Middle School, the only change there from the last waterfall you saw is the slight increase in price due to better pricing. Walter Fitzgerald Roofing Project is a project we put in as a placeholder should the we know that we need to do some work there. We increased the price slightly using the numbers for replacing the roof if need be. We want to try to watertight the building as much as possible, so that's why we put that in there as a placeholder. The next one down, as you guys are aware, the Archdiocese asked us if we may be interested in purchasing the building. So again, we put a placeholder in there based on your guys' decision to move forwards with that or not, but the placeholder was placed in case we did have to go to the financial summit, which I guess is going to be pushed off now. But it's there. And the last one is the Fairfield Ludlow High School emergency generator. This generator is for Fairfield Ludlow High School, which is the emergency center for the whole town. Last year, we put approximately $11,000 into keeping it up and running. The generator, because of its age, is not supported with equipment, so parts are not readily available and take quite a bit of time to arrive. In addition to that, replacing the generator, we would also replace the fuel tank that it sits on top of, which is a single wall unit, which is now no longer code and is also has some signs of wear and possible fatigue and failure in the future. So we would need to replace both of those. It doesn't make sense to replace the fuel tank without the generator, and the generator being as in poor condition as it is. So those are what you're seeing for the changes for the waterfall for this year.
Mr. Asa, I know you had a question.
I have a few. So first, I appreciate your bringing us up to date on the Mill Hill controls. I think we absolutely have to make sure that that is part of the project because I believe it's budgeted in that $20 million project.
It is budgeted in the project. Okay. We just need to make sure we can get it scheduled. It's more of a scheduling thing, which I've worked with Sal, and we do believe it will not be a problem.
Okay. With regards to the other document, Enclosure 6 here, going down on the 21-22, we have the Jennings addition and renovations at 3.53 million. And if we go to the next page, on line 64, I'm showing a Mill Hill roof project of $1 million. But in this document here, Enclosure 5, it's referencing that as Jennings. I believe, not Mill Hill. Page 25. So if you look on page 25, it's referencing roof replacement project for Jennings Elementary School of 1.28 million. So just need to get that clarified if you could.
We'll definitely get
because that should be part of the Jennings large project.
Yes, absolutely.
And we shouldn't be seeing anything for Mill Hill in 24-25. That should be part of the $20 million project.
Yes.
Okay. And then also, just of note, on page 29 of the spiral book, it's showing, bear with me 1 second, Jennings Elementary School roof replacement project at 1.55 million. So that's showing on page 29 of the spiral book. So I'm guessing that's going to have to come out too.
Just eliminated entirely?
I would be assuming that that's going to be part of the project, which is well before 2028. And then also on page 29, the transportation portable classroom replacement of 300,000. That's just for the board to know that something to address that's going to have to be done sooner than that. With regards, we've had some discussions, especially with your predecessor, about the Ludlow bathrooms.
Yes.
Being pushed out to 22-23. I'd just like to see if there's some way that we can work on trying to get that budgeted sooner, because I think the longer we put that off, the more it's going to cost us, because we're going to be doing piecemeal repairs up until that point. The other thing, so Sherman Phase 4. We've put it appears to be a $3 million placeholder, and I'm assuming that's because it's close to the FEMA cap.
Correct.
based on what we saw tonight and what's being done and what we approved in the plans, am I wrong to assume that we shouldn't technically be anywhere near that number?
That would be the hope. Mr. Cullen had put that in originally, as you said, because it's near the FEMA cap, and we didn't fully understand what the scope would be when Phase 3 is completed.
Okay. So we go to, bear with me 1 second, I forgot to circle one thing here. Can someone point out the Dwight renovation?
It's in
23, 24.
23, 24, okay. Okay, 5.681, and then when I looked in this, in the spiral book as to what it encompassed, based on your experience and our previous experiences of projects in the last 5 years, how confident are we on that number, or should we be now planning for a larger number? So when we go to the plan for this and we present to the Board of Finance and whatever else we do, we're looking at real numbers, because clearly the last couple projects have come in way higher than what we had budgeted for years ago.
Can you tell me what line you're on? I'm sorry.
Line 59 of enclosure 6.
So we can definitely look at the numbers versus what they were. I have to tell you that moving forwards, this year we focused, this summer being when I came in, we focused on what we needed to do for this summer to get this ready to move into this fiscal year and get it ready and prepared. We have not, and I apologize, but we have not moved forwards into the future and really focused and gotten into numbers moving forwards. We used what was existing there as the placeholders, and the intention is throughout this fiscal year to really focus in on those numbers and get better control over them. We want to be a lot closer, or as close as possible, to the actual numbers with the years coming up.
Okay, and so thank you, and I appreciate that. I appreciate a fresh set of eyes, as Mr. Cummings said, and really honing in on this year. But it does bring me back to the point which I've mentioned at previous meetings. I think we do need to look in the very near future at a facilities committee of some kind that can work in conjunction with coming up with a new plan, or whether it be new or not, at least revisiting this and looking at our new, because our priorities have changed. And also in that, in the spiral book towards the front, we have the facilities principles on page 1. So I think as part of that work, we need to relook at that and see if we're going to stick with those or not. But I believe now is the time, as you said, before you start delving and spending a tremendous amount of time on numbers, let's make sure that the board is together in unison on this is where we're going. And if it is, great. If not, let's work on making some changes.
Absolutely. I would welcome a committee.
Thank you.
And I think in the short term, Ms. Leeper, we can go through the numbers that are on the spreadsheet now, and the Finance Committee in the upcoming months, just to maybe spend some more time, because I know that you unfortunately get the end of our meetings, and very often we're kind of rushed through. So just some time that we can sit down and kind of delve into it a little bit deeper. Mrs. Gerber.
On the enclosure number 6, line 44, I think it's just a typo. It says Fairfield Woods Middle School renovate student bathrooms, but in the long-range plan, it says ward bathrooms. So it's just a letter that needs to be changed, if that is, because, well, one of them is wrong, I guess.
So that was line 40?
Line 44, it says FWMS, renovate student bathrooms, for 1.4, but here in the book, on page 22, it has Fairfield Ward High School renovate student bathrooms for 1.447. So just that was just one thing. And then just really quickly, just to reiterate what Mr. Acer was saying, I am a PAC rat, and so I have this facilities plan from 2011, and some of the costs, some of the prices in here are the same ones that are in here. So,
Absolutely. I admit to that, and I do know that we need to focus
Yeah,
on getting
just
better
'cause
numbers.
a lot of these numbers, I would imagine, would be considerably higher, especially like some of the Windows projects, Osborne Hill, God bless them, their renovation, which has been pushed out again to sometime after 2028, and it's still the same amount that it was in 2011. So just put that out there. Thank you.
We will definitely.
Any other questions?
Just have one?
Yep.
More comment? The Walter Fitzgerald Campus Line 31.
Yes.
It would strike me that purchase and renovation of that kind of campus is going to be more than the 2 million. And suggesting that number of 2 million might suggest to the owner that that's what we've planned for purchase. So I think some comment should be put in the comment section so that that doesn't become a, what's poker term, a tell. Or make that 2 million, 5 million. I mean, to be realistic. So I only make that caution. I agree that the numbers need to be really looked at, but the methodology that Mr. Cullen frequently used was to add 2 or 3% out to a certain year, and he may think that that 2%, that inflation, is already factored into the 15 plan or the 11 plan. But a lot has happened. I think Mrs. Gerber is correct. A lot has happened. So irrespective of whether the math was done correctly or not, it's time for a new, fresh look at it.
Anybody else?
Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, stay here. First read of UI Energy Opportunity Program, proposed project at Fairfield Ward Middle School.
So this I'm going to bring Sal up because he's been working on these programs. Oh. This is a LED lighting program that Sal has been working diligently on getting up for us.
Could I ask the first question? How many of these have we voted on?
I know. Are there any significant changes to this program as opposed to past programs that we voted on?
The only change this year is there's a bonus. So hopefully you can act tonight so that I can get them going. If we complete the upgrade before the end of the calendar year, we're getting a bonus of $33,000 of that $78,000 that you read in the material. It's pretty straightforward. It's what we've seen before. The opportunity with UI is that they will finance energy upgrades. The savings on energy actually pays for the bill. It's on bill financing. We actually see a decrease in our billing because we're saving more money than we're paying in finance. 0% financing, but our payback. And the last project we did was front to back, top to bottom was McKinley. We changed the LED lights. Beautiful. The utility bills dropped as expected, some $45,000 a year. And this is in the same range. So it's wonderful, wonderful.
Wonderful, wonderful.
New light bulb.
Mr. Asa?
Just to clarify, the 78,000 incentive includes the bonus of 30,000?
33, yes.
33, so that's all in, 78.
That's all in.
Okay. And just one thing I noticed on here, you may have just answered it, but my question was based on the estimated 57% reduction.
Yes.
How does that compare to McKinley, let's say? I know you said 45,000, but is it roughly, I mean, just for budgeting purposes. So we're saving 47,000 or whatever a year, but we're paying 33,000. So for budgeting purposes moving forward, is it safe to say that this estimate based on other projects is accurate?
Yes.
Okay. And then one last thing, total money saved for the 5-year warranty period. I just think you can have them check that number because the first 3 years we have a payment and then years 4 and 5 we don't. So I calculated a savings of 135 versus 236, but which
It's
is
saying energy savings only. It's
Yeah.
not, it's not talking about the payback.
yeah. So,
So-
but it says on the title, total money saved, and then it says energy savings. So just to point that out as a clarification, it's still awesome, but
Yeah.
it's about 100,000 less than what it says.
Correct. You're paying, what you're paying back is just about 101. If you go back to page 2, you're paying $100,982 for some $180,000 worth of lights and installs, but you're saving all that money on the energy.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, just one.
Mr. Dwyer?
I understand that it would be your fondest dream that we actually take action tonight.
Yeah.
Would the chair accept a motion to add this as an action item?
I would accept that.
So moved.
Do I have a second? Mrs. Maxinelli?
This is to add it as an action item
Accept-
first, right?
To add it as an action item. All in favor? 9-0. It is on as an action item. Any questions? What? Ms. Jacobson?
The wording of the motion? No, sorry. No. Sorry. Go ahead.
The recommended motion would be to approve the UI Energy Opportunity Program for Fairfield Woods Middle School. So
Can I have a motion to approve?
Just move that?
I am moving that.
Thank you,
I'll
Mrs.
second it.
Gerber. Thank you, Mr. Dwyer.
Just one quick thing. Do we have to add to that motion to authorize somebody to sign it? Included in the wording? Sal?
That would close it all out, sure. That would tie it all together.
Okay, so the motion would be to approve the UI Energy Opportunity Program for Fairfield Woods Middle School.
And authorize
Be
the,
executed
be-
by.
Authorize the Executive Director of Operations to sign the
And to,
contract.
Or so just to authorize,
the Executive Director of Operations to sign? That's
Sign the
to
contract.
execute?
Sign the
execute
contract.
all,
To execute the contract.
To execute the contract.
close enough.
Okay, so the motion is to approve the UI Energy Opportunity Program for Fairfield Woods Middle School and to authorize the Executive Director of Operations to execute the contract.
can I have a motion?
No.
That was I made
that
the
was
motion.
She's just
I'm
restating
restating
the
it.
motion.
So
Okay.
I made it, he seconded it.
I'm fading fast here, guys. Any public on this new motion? No. Okay, back to the board. All in favor? Motion passes 9-0.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Superintendent's report.
minutes.
No, oh, minutes. All right. Recommend a motion that the Board of Education approve the June 25th, 2019 regular meeting minutes of the July 31st, 2019, 6:30 special meeting minutes, and the July 31st, 2019, 7 p.m. Special meeting minutes. Can I have a motion? Mrs. Gerber, seconded by Ms. Leeper. All in favor? Motion passes 9-0. Superintendent's report.
Okay, real quick, I have something just to report, and then I'm going to ask Ms. Deasy to talk over the summative, legislative summary, as well as, Mr. Papageorge is going to pop back up again because we want to just have a summer work review done quickly. But real quick, my point of information is that all bus drivers this year have been trained on recognizing anaphylaxis and the administration of epinephrine auto-injectors for students with known life-threatening food allergies. I just wanted people to be aware of that. This is because of Public Act 18-185, and it is effective this year. So this obviously closes an important safety gap for students traveling back and forth to schools, with the bus drivers now being able to carry them. And students, I think this is widely known, but students can carry their EpiPens with them as well now. That's all been approved in the legislation. Okay, parents definitely make an effort to the school's starting to make sure that the kids on the bus know the bus driver knows the kids on the bus, kids who might be carrying these things. So that we're just closing the circle one more time. Ms. Deasy.
So there was a legislative update packet, and that went out to you guys last week. I'm happy to answer any questions on it in the interest of time. The only major issue that we're taking up with policy committee at the moment is with the act concerning the improvement of child development through play, and we'll be updating our physical exercise and discipline policy to reflect the changes in the law. Other than that, there are significant changes we'll have to make to our bullying and harassment policies, but that's not until 2021. So we have some time on that.
Any questions for Ms. Deasy? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Papa George, could you come up? I don't know why you went back. But if you could, summer work update, and I think probably given the interest of time, for the board's and the public's interest, is there anything we need to be worried about with school starting in 2 days?
Worried
36
about.
hours.
No. Short answer. Couple of things that are running tight are our upgrade to our Cat 6 system at Woods Middle School, but that should be completed by tomorrow evening. The front walkway at Woods Middle School is a concern because the contractor that was awarded the bid back in early spring poured the front walkway 3 times now and has ripped it out twice already at their own discretion because they didn't like the way it looked. So we finally have a sidewalk that looks decent. However, we still do not have railings for the front walkway up the stairs. We have reached out many times to the contractor, who is no longer in the country, is what we're being told. So we are working to figure out a way around that. The stairs are still functional, they're still usable, the front entranceway is usable, we just do not have the railings at this time. If people are uncomfortable with that, we do have there is the ADA ramp on the side there that is usable. So we're just working on getting the railings there, which we're hopeful will show up tomorrow. That's the big.
Just very briefly, in the past, sometimes with this update, we would actually get a hard copy list of those projects that were done. If it would be possible for us to get that in a Friday packet or something, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. I'm sorry, I wasn't aware that I was going to give this update, so I would have gotten that for you.
You've been a little busy.
A little busy
But
today.
the list is important because it is always an impressive list
Yes.
that you and your staff got done. So it's good to toot our horn every once in a while for the staff who work so hard for us.
Definitely. We will get that list to you. I've not changed the format. We've still used Mr. Cullen's format. It's worked out very good. The only thing we have done is added colors, so all our supervisors now have their own color and they can look at it quickly and know if it's their project or not.
Okay. And thank you. Thank you for all your work this summer.
Thank you.
Any committee or liaison reports? Nope.
Just very briefly, policy met yesterday, and policy is meeting again next Tuesday. I do anticipate, I'm frequently wrong, but I do anticipate both a policy coming, the one that Ms. Deasy referenced, as well as the Board of Ed handbook. Very decent chance that we will vote that out of policy next week. A heads up to you that that's over 30 pages, so hope people can give it a few minutes.
Anyone else? Open board comment? Mr. Peterson.
I just want to acknowledge very quickly that Dr. Tony Jones has joined our wall of fame here in the conference room. We unfortunately did not get a chance to say goodbye to her at our last meeting in June, but I do think that it's a nice tribute to have her there. She had a very important impact on our students in our district, and I, for one, wish her well, and I'm sure everyone else on the board does as well.
Mrs. Gerber.
Just really quickly wanted to say that as Mrs. Vitale and I were at the convocation yesterday, it was my 8th year of going to convocation, and it was an absolutely fantastic one, and I just want to give a really huge shout out to Mr. Cummings. He totally had the audience in the palm of his hand. They were laughing at his jokes. They were quiet when he was doing something serious. He was walking around like Tony Robbins with his microphone. It was such a great thing. I was so excited. It made me want to go back to school and become a teacher and come work here in Fairfield. So thank you so much. It was really terrific. And I don't know if it's been was it taped by any chance, Mrs. Brent? Oh, it's such a shame because it was such a great presentation, and it just made me really hyped up and excited. So thank you for that.
Thank you for coming.
Mr. Dwyer?
Prior to coming to the board meeting, I was at Town Green for a recognition program of sports, but they also recognized a rising junior at Ludlow named Adrian. I forget his last name at the moment. Blank. Aiden Blank, who started broadcasting Bluefish games when he was young, and he would just talk into a Coke bottle or something. And if you've gone to Ludlow games, you see him on the side doing a play-by-play of the sports. And he was invited by ESPN to broadcast one of the Little League games in Williamsport. And they recognized him for his talent and work. And I think it's just another example of the various talents that our students display and bring fame and recognition to this school district.
I went to a census meeting today in Norwalk that was held by the Lieutenant Governor and Representative Himes. We are starting to count in 2020. It is very important that everyone gets counted, just for funding, for education, and for representation. I have some information which I will pass on to the school district on how we can get just students involved and reach out to all of our families. And just wanted to share that. And the town is forming a committee also. Public comment. If any members of the public would like to make comment. Seeing none, motion to adjourn. Mr. Asa, second by Ms. Jacobson. All in favor? Motion passes 9-0.
Barely.
What?